The food had been sitting there for 3 days. Nobody touched it. Nobody moved it. Nobody even looked at it directly. The way people avoid eye contact with something that makes them feel guilty just for existing. The tray sat on the black granite side table beside the bed. A bowl of rice porridge, a small dish of pickled vegetables, a cup of barley tea gone completely cold. The porridge had developed a thin, cracked skin across the top. The steam was long gone. The smell had changed from something warm and edible to something stale and forgotten. And the man in the bed? He could smell every bit of it. Kwon Taejin lay completely still beneath a white linen sheet, his chest rising and falling only because a machine made it happen. His eyes, dark, sharp, fully open, tracked the ceiling above him the way a man reads a map he already knows by heart. Every crack, every seam in the plaster, every change in the light as hours bled into hours. He was awake. He was always awake. That was the part nobody in that penthouse wanted to think about too hard. That behind the stillness, behind the unmoving body and the silent mouth, there was a mind that had not stopped working for a single second since the night he collapsed. 47 days. He had counted every one of them. The machines around him breathed steadily, their soft, mechanical rhythm filling a room that had once smelled of imported whiskey and expensive decisions. Now it smelled of antiseptic, and something he had never once associated with his own life. Neglect. Well, there was a nurse assigned to this floor, a woman in her 40s named Park Ji-yeon, who had lasted longer than the others. She came in every morning at 6, checked the monitors, wrote something in a clipboard she never let him see, and left within 4 minutes. She did not speak to him. She did not look at him for more than 2 seconds at a time. On day 43, she had stopped replacing the food trays entirely. Nobody above her had corrected it, which told Taejin everything he needed to know about where things stood. The bedroom windows were floor-to-ceiling glass, the kind that cost more than most people made in a year. And beyond them, Seoul stretched in every direction, brilliant and indifferent. Glass towers catching morning light, the Han River cutting silver through the city below, yet traffic moving in slow rivers across the bridges. Life continuing at full speed while he lay here unable to lift a single finger to prove he was still part of it. He had built things in that city. Not the kind of things you put your name on. Not buildings or companies or foundations with press events and ribbon cuttings. The things Kwon Taejin built were invisible to everyone except the people who needed them and feared them. Shipping routes that moved more than cargo. Investment networks that answered to no government. Political arrangements that rewrote outcomes before the public ever voted on anything. He had sat in rooms where the actual decisions were made, 3 floors below the rooms where the official decisions were announced. He had watched powerful men perform their power for cameras while he sat in the back with no cameras pointed at him, drinking green tea and already knowing what tomorrow would look like. He had been untouchable. He had believed that word completely. And now the food on his tray was 3 days old, and the woman who was supposed to care for him had not walked through that door in 11 hours. And somewhere in this same building, in the office suite 2 floors down that had once been his, things were being signed and moved and rerouted by hands that were not his. He knew whose hands they were. He had seen her face right before the darkness took him at the gathering. Right before his legs went. Right before his hands stopped responding and the room began to tilt and the sound of voices around him became distant and strange. In that last clear second of physical control he had ever had, he had seen her. Calm. Completely calm. Watching him the way a person watches something they planned. The memory sat behind his eyes now like a coal that would not cool. He could not scream it out. He could not pick up a phone. He could not call his security team or his lawyers or the 3 men who had stood beside him for the last 15 years and would have burned the city down on his order. Those 3 men were gone. He did not know where. Gone was enough. A sound in the hallway. Taejin's eyes shifted, the one movement that still fully belonged to him, toward the door. The footsteps were different. And every person who entered this room moved the same way, fast, purposeful, contained. The walk of people who wanted to spend as little time as possible in a room with a man they were afraid of and pitied and could not look at directly all at once. The walk of people who had been quietly ordered to reduce their contact without anyone using those exact words. These footsteps were slower, not hesitant, not fearful, just unhurried. Like someone who actually looked at where they were walking instead of rushing to be somewhere else. The door opened. She was younger than he expected. Late 20s, maybe. Dark skin, natural hair pulled back from her face in a simple, practical way. She wore the plain uniform of the domestic agency, gray, so forgettable, but she carried herself like someone who had learned a long time ago that forgettable was useful. Her eyes moved around the room in one clean sweep, the way a person takes inventory without making it obvious that's what they're doing. She saw the tray. She stopped. Not dramatically, just stopped. Her gaze went from the tray to the untouched food, to the hardened surface of the porridge, to the cold cup of tea, and something shifted in her expression that was not pity exactly, but was not nothing either. Then she looked at him. Most people, when they looked at him now, looked somewhere near him, at his forehead, at the pillow behind his head, at the monitors. Anywhere that let them feel like they'd met the obligation of acknowledging him without actually having to make contact with what they saw in his eyes. She looked directly at him, steady, unafraid, like someone who had already decided something before she walked through that door. She set down the fresh supplies she was carrying on the far counter, pulled off her jacket, looked at the tray again. Then she looked back at him and said nothing. Just picked up the tray with both hands, walked to the door and set it outside in the hallway. Came back, looked at the monitors without touching anything, looked at him again. The silence between them was the loudest thing in the room, and somewhere above the ceiling, in the small, dark eye of the security camera mounted in the upper corner of the room, a red indicator light blinked once. Someone was already watching. Before we go any further, if you've ever seen someone treated like they no longer mattered, just because they could no longer fight back, drop an eye emoji in the comments. Because what happens next in this room is going to stay with you. And if you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for one reason and one reason only. We tell the stories they tried to bury. Hit that subscribe button and stay close because this story is only just beginning. And what this woman is about to discover about the man in that bed will change everything you think you know about justice, mercy, and the price of secrets kept too long. The camera was still recording when she came back with a warm bowl. Nobody had authorized that. Nobody had told her to. Which meant only one thing. Somewhere in this building, someone had just noticed that the one rule everyone silently agreed to follow had been broken by the one person who had no idea what that rule was going to cost her. Chapter 2. 12 years before the tray sat cold on that black granite table, Kwon Taejin walked into a room in Busan and ended a man's career in 11 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply placed a single manila folder on the table between them, let the man open it, watched the man's face change, and then said very quietly, "You have until Friday." Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and left. The man resigned from public office the following Thursday. That was how Taejin worked. Not with chaos, with precision. He understood very early, earlier than most men in his position ever figured out, that visible power was borrowed power. The men who needed people to see their authority were men who were not fully sure of it themselves. Real control didn't look like anything. Real control looked like a Tuesday. He had grown up in the margins. Not poor, his family had money enough, but he had grown up watching what money without structure looked like. His father had been the kind of man who made and lost fortunes on instinct and pride, who built things quickly and burned them just as fast, who treated loyalty like a renewable resource. Taejin had learned from that, but not the lesson his father intended. What he learned was that emotion was the most expensive thing a powerful man could afford to show, so he stopped showing it. By 30, he had built the first layer of what would become his network, logistics initially, legitimate shipping contracts running between Busan and Incheon with routes that extended out to Los Angeles, Rotterdam, Singapore. The legal business was real and profitable and gave him exactly what he needed, a reason for money to move and a structure that made it invisible when other things moved with it. By 35, he had the politicians. Not all of them. He was selective. He chose the ones who were already compromised, men and women who had already made the quiet choices that put them in reach of someone like him. And he simply made their compromises more organized, more protected, in exchange for things that were never written down. By 40, people in certain rooms said his name the way they said the names of weather systems. Why not with hatred, not with admiration, with the specific understanding that he was a condition to be managed rather than a person to be opposed. He had a penthouse above the city. He had a staff of 11, each of them loyal in the particular way that money and fear combine to produce loyalty. He had a woman on his arm at the events that required one, Han Seoryeon. She appeared in his life through the architecture firm that had redesigned the interior of his Gangnam office. She was consulting on the project, recommended by a mutual contact whose name was spoken in the kind of circles that did not show up on any organizational chart. She was 31. She held 3 degrees from institutions that cost real money to attend. She had taste that was effortless and specific. She could walk into any room and immediately identify exactly what was wrong with it without looking like she was assessing anything. She was also watching everything. He had noticed that about her, early. The way her eyes moved when she thought no one was looking at her eyes. The way she filed information. You could actually see it. The small pause when something registered. The fractional reorganization before her expression settled back into neutral. He had found it attractive. That was the mistake. He had mistaken her precision for compatibility. He had seen her and recognized something that looked like him and had assumed that meant alignment. He had brought her into the edges of his world gradually. Dinners with associates. My events where the real conversations happened in coat rooms and staircases, introductions that carried weight. And she had moved through all of it with such flawless ease that he had started to believe she belonged there. She did belong there. That was the problem. The night of the gathering, Taejin's penthouse had been arranged the way he liked it for events of that particular weight, which meant it did not look arranged at all. The catering was Japanese, understated, served on black ceramic. The lighting was low and warm. The guest list was 12 people, none of them publicly adjacent to each other, all of them connected through 3 or 4 layers of agreements that would have required a dedicated investigator years to map. There was a shipping executive whose containers moved through ports in 3 countries. There was a man who managed political relationships in a province where Taejin had recently expanded interests. There was a foreign investor who had been introduced 6 months prior and whose background had checked out perfectly across every layer Taejin's people had verified. That last detail would matter later. The evening moved the way these evenings moved, slowly, carefully, the real conversation wrapped in the performance of social ease. Taejin moved through it with the comfort of a man conducting an orchestra he had assembled. He knew where everyone stood. He knew what everyone needed. He knew what the night was supposed to produce. He was pouring his second glass of water. He rarely drank alcohol at these things. When it started. Not pain. He had expected, somewhere in the architecture of his own mind, was that if something ever came for him, it would feel like pain. An event. A threshold. It did not feel like that. It felt like subtraction. First the left hand. A heaviness that was strange enough to notice, but not strange enough to alarm. He looked at it without expression, the way he looked at most things, and flexed his fingers once. They moved, but slowly, with a lag he had not given them. Then his legs. He set the glass down. Deliberately, with full focus on making that single action look normal. The room continued around him. Conversation. The quiet sound of a jazz recording playing somewhere, the clink of ceramic. He made it to the window, the floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city, and stood there with one hand braced against the frame looking out, performing the posture of a man who had stepped away to think. He was, in fact, calculating time. How long before it was obvious, whether his phone was within reach, whether anyone in this room was actually his. He turned his head, not his body, just his head, slowly, and scanned the room the way he had scanned rooms for 20 years. And he found her. Seoul was standing near the far wall, a glass of something sparkling in her hand, talking to the foreign investor. She was laughing at something. Genuinely, it appeared, but her eyes had moved to him. They did not dart away when he caught them. She held his gaze, and she smiled. Not the social smile she wore for these events, something quieter than that. Something that knew exactly what it was communicating and was communicating it on purpose. Well, he understood in that moment, with a completeness that arrived all at once the way important truths sometimes do, that the foreign investor had not been an oversight, that the background check had only been as thorough as the information she had chosen to leave accessible, that the 6 months of ease and flawless integration had been architecture, hers. The floor moved, or his legs gave. He could not tell, in the instant of the falling, which one it was, the floor or him. He grabbed the window frame and missed, and the glass came toward him fast, and then everything went sideways and the room, for one fractured second, showed him the ceiling. The sound that followed was controlled. That was the last thing he registered before the world narrowed to a corridor of dim, narrowing light. Not chaos, not screaming. The sound of people moving with purpose, measured voices, someone close to his ear saying something clinical, and then nothing. Not darkness. Taejin would not have darkness for 47 days. What came instead was a stillness so complete and foreign to his entire life that it took him many hours to understand what it was. His body had stopped. His mind had not. He woke, if waking was the right word for returning to awareness inside a body that would not respond. To machines, to white walls, to a penthouse he recognized, but that now felt like someone else's space. His space, rearranged, cleaned, made clinical. And immediately, before the confusion of his first conscious moments in that bed had fully resolved, he knew. He was not going to a hospital. He was not going to be seen by anyone outside this building. He was staying here, in this room, because the person who had made the arrangements for his care had decided that public knowledge of his condition would complicate things. He was staying here because disappearing quietly served someone else's purpose better than any other outcome. And the first person who walked through that door after he came back to awareness, a nurse who lasted 8 days before transferring her assignment, had looked at him with an expression he had only ever seen directed at other people. The look of someone who expects no response, the look of someone who has already filed you in the past tense. It was the most dangerous moment of Kwon Taejin's life, not the poisoning, not the fall. This. The moment he understood that the empire he had spent his entire life constructing was already moving on without him, and that the woman who had taken it was moving it with exactly the precision and patience that he had, mistakenly, fatally, spent 2 years admiring. He would lie in that bed for 47 days. And on the 47th, the day the food on the tray had cracked and staled and the room had gone 11 hours without a single visitor, the door had opened with a different kind of footstep, the kind that was not in a hurry to leave. What he did not know, could not know, not yet, was that the woman who had just removed his cold tray and was now, somewhere down the hall, heating something fresh without anyone telling her to, had carried a name in her memory for years. His name, not as an employer, not as a patient, as an answer to a question that had shaped her entire life, and she did not yet know she was standing inside it. At what point do you think Taejin realized Seoul had planned this from the beginning? The first dinner, the investor, or the moment she smiled? Tell us in the comments, because the timeline of this betrayal is more layered than it looks. Down the hall, in the small staff kitchen that still smelled of someone else's lunch, a woman named Zariah Cole was warming rice porridge in a pan she had found in the back of a cabinet. She had not been asked to do this. She had not been told it was her responsibility. She did it the way people do things when they have decided something and stopped waiting for permission. She did not yet know that every room in this building had a camera. She did not yet know that 2 floors below, a monitor showed her, clear, time-stamped, undeniable, doing something that everyone else in this building had silently agreed not to do. And she did not yet know that the woman watching that monitor had already said 3 words to the man standing beside her. 3 words that were not a question. Keep watching her. Chapter 3. The worst part was not the stillness. Taejin had expected stillness to be the worst part. In the first days, when the paralysis was so new and foreign that his mind kept sending commands to his body with the full expectation they would be obeyed, he had thought the stillness was the thing that would destroy him. The absence of movement, the inability to cross a room or pick up a phone or walk to a window. But stillness was just geography. Stillness was just location. The worst part was hearing everything. He heard the nurses whisper in the hallway. He heard the security team change shifts at 6 and at midnight, the shuffle of boots and the low exchange of words that meant nothing when the words were small and meant everything when they went quiet too quickly. He heard the cleaning staff avoid his room on Tuesdays, which was when they used to rotate the thorough clean through his floor, and the absence of that sound told him more clearly than anything else could have that procedures had been changed. Quietly, without announcement. He heard Seoryun's heels on the stone floor of the hallway twice in 47 days. She did not come in. Both times she stopped outside the door for somewhere between 30 and 60 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, and then continued down the hall to the elevator. He had listened to those pauses with every fragment of attention he had, trying to read what they meant, whether they were check-ins or something else, whether she stood there because she was monitoring or because some remaining human part of her had not yet entirely severed what had existed between them. He decided, by the second time, that she was monitoring. He did not let himself think about the alternative because it was a softness he could not afford, and because even in this state, especially in this state, Kwon Taejin understood that the way a person chose to interpret the facts in front of them said more about their survival instincts than about the facts themselves. She was monitoring. Move on. The first week, he had tried to make systems out of what he could still control. His eyes moved freely. That was something. A full range of motion, peripheral vision intact, the ability to track movement across the room without limitation. He cataloged everything that entered his field of vision. Every person who came through the door. Every change in the placement of objects around him. He built a picture of his own situation using only what his eyes could gather and what his ears could collect, the way a man lost in a foreign country builds a map using only landmarks. The door, which direction it opened and who knocked before entering versus who didn't. The window, which hours the light shifted, what that told him about time of day when he had no clock he could see. The monitors, he couldn't read the numbers, but he could hear the pitch changes in the tones, learn which sounds were normal and which preceded a change in the room. The people. The people were the most important data. Park Ji-yeon, the nurse who came at 6, she had lasted the longest, but her behavior had been deteriorating in a specific, measurable way that Taejin had tracked with the same attention he'd once given to market patterns. First week, 4 minutes per visit, full monitoring check, eye contact avoided but present. Second week, 3 minutes, check perfunctory, no eye contact at all. Third week, 2 minutes and 40 seconds, clipboard writing had stopped. She was not actually recording anything. Fourth week, she stopped entering the room entirely and simply verified through the doorway that the machines were still functioning. He was a box to be confirmed checked, not a person to be assessed. That transition had taken 22 days. He did not blame her. He had spent too much of his life understanding how people worked to waste energy on blame. She had been given signals, through atmosphere, through observed behavior, through the tone of people above her, that this patient was not one whose quality of care would be scrutinized, that doing less was not only tolerated but expected. People responded to their environments. He had used that fact his entire career. Now it was being used on him. The food situation had begun on day 28. It started as inconsistency, a tray that arrived late, then cold, then smaller, then not at all for a full day before a replacement came. He had absorbed each change without reaction because reaction was not available to him, which meant he had processed each change with a thoroughness that was almost unbearable. He thought about food the way a man thinks about air when it begins to thin. Not frantically, but with a constant, low, consuming focus that took up more and more of the space in his mind as the days extended. By day 43, he had started to understand, with a clarity that was both rational and terrifying, that this was not neglect through carelessness. This was direction. Someone had made a choice somewhere, communicated it through the specific vocabulary of reduced instruction and plausible deniability, not an order anyone could be held to, but a change in temperature that everyone in the building had read and adjusted to accordingly. And the thing about direction communicated that way, without words, through atmosphere and implication, was that Taejin had invented it. He had used exactly that method dozens of times. He let the environment speak. Let the silence give the order. Never write it down. Never say it plainly. Just adjust the temperature of a room and let every person in it find their way to the conclusion you need them to reach without you ever having to be the one who said it. He lay in the bed and recognized his own technique being used against him, and there was a specific kind of horror in that recognition that was almost something close to what other people might call justice. Almost. His right hand was the first thing that came back. He would not know that for another 3 weeks. For now, deep in the architecture of his paralysis, there were things repairing themselves in ways that no one had bothered to check for because no one had ordered a current assessment of his neurological state. The machines tracked what they tracked. Nobody had asked them to look for anything new. Something was returning. Slowly, like light coming back into a room through a crack so thin you could look directly at it and wonder if you were imagining it. But first, he would have to survive the waiting. And waiting, for a man who had spent his entire adult life being the one thing that other people waited on, was its own specific form of dismantling. He lay in the bed, and the hours moved over him, and the room changed with the light, and the machines breathed, and he listened. To everything, to nothing, to the particular quality of silence that fell between midnight and 3 in the morning when even the building seemed to exhale. He thought about his father. He thought about the man in Busan with the manila folder, who had looked at what was in it and understood in a single moment that the life he had constructed was no longer his. He thought about Seoryeon standing at the far wall with a glass in her hand, holding his gaze while his legs became unfamiliar to him. He thought about the things he had done that nobody had ever named aloud, the people who had been moved out of the way, the arrangements that had required human cost in places where the humans were too far away or too powerless or too unconnected for their cost to show up in any ledger anyone who mattered would read. He thought about these things not because he had ever thought about them this way before, but because when you are lying in a bed and cannot move and cannot speak and cannot eat and can hear every whisper in every hallway and nobody is coming through the door, the things you have always kept in the locked room at the back of your mind begin, very slowly, to walk toward you. And he was alone with them, until day 47, when she came back. She came back with a bowl of rice porridge that was warm. He could see the thin line of steam rising from it. And she moved through the doorway without hesitation, without the performed reluctance of everyone else who entered this room. And she set the bowl and a clean spoon on the table and pulled the chair closer to the bed in a single economical motion. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I don't know what happened here, but you haven't eaten." That was all. She didn't explain herself. She didn't introduce herself again or reference the agency or justify her presence. She just picked up the spoon and looked at him with a directness that he had not experienced from another human being in 47 days and said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me the best way you can." She leaned forward slightly. "If you understand what I'm saying, blink twice." The room held itself completely still. Taejin, who had not communicated a single piece of information to any person in 47 days, who had watched his world dismantle itself around him through eyes that everyone assumed were simply open without seeing, looked at her and blinked. Twice. The moment she leaned forward and asked him to blink, "What went through your mind?" Drop it in the comments. And the real question, if you were Zariah knowing nothing yet, would you have asked? Or would you have just fed him and left? She fed him. Slowly, carefully, with the kind of patience that is not kindness exactly, but is something older than kindness. The simple, stubborn refusal to watch a living thing go without what it needs. He ate. And while she was focused on the bowl and the spoon and the careful logistics of feeding a person who cannot lift their own head, she did not see what he saw. Directly above her left shoulder, in the upper corner of the room, the small red eye of the camera blinking steadily in the dark. Recording the time. Recording her face. Recording the spoon moving from the bowl to his mouth and back again with a patience that, 2 floors below, one woman was watching with an expression that had not changed since she first pressed play. And in the 11 seconds of silence between one spoonful and the next, Seoul reached forward and typed 4 words into the message field of an encrypted phone, sent them without reading them back, and set the phone face down on the desk. Asterisk. #Chapter 4. The order never came in writing. It never does, with people like Seoul. That was the first thing she had understood about power when she was still young enough that the understanding felt like a discovery instead of a confirmation, that the most dangerous instructions are the ones that leave no record of ever being given. You shape the environment. You adjust the temperature. You let people draw their own conclusions and arrive at your intended destination, believing it was their own idea. She had learned from the best. She just happened to be looking at him from across a room when his legs gave out. The staff received no memo about Taejin's care, no formal directive, no meeting. What they received, in the 10 days after the gathering, was something far more effective. A shift in tone. A cooler response when updates about the patient were given. A silence in place of follow-up questions. A sense, absorbed through the air rather than through any stated policy, that excessive engagement with the man in the penthouse bedroom was not something the current administration of this building regarded as a priority. People are extraordinarily good at reading these signals. By the end of the 2nd week, Park Ji-yeon had reduced her visits without being asked. By the 3rd week, the kitchen staff had stopped confirming whether the tray sent up had been consumed. By the 4th, the monitoring logs, which should have been daily, were being updated every 3 to 4 days, each entry copying the language of the previous one with small cosmetic changes that meant nothing had actually been checked. The machine of neglect required no active cruelty. It ran on indifference, which was easier to produce and far harder to trace. Seoul understood this with the kind of clean, unsentimental clarity that she had cultivated over years of watching how systems actually functioned as opposed to how they were described. She had walked into Taejin's world with a specific purpose and a specific timeline and the patience to let both of them run without forcing them. She had watched and studied and positioned herself, not just in his life, but in the connective tissue of his operation. The mid-level relationships and financial routing and communication channels that most people at his level delegated entirely and therefore never fully understood. She had understood them. In the weeks after his collapse, she had not taken control loudly. She had not announced anything. She had simply been present, consistent, calm, responsive, in the vacuum his absence created. When Taejin's associates reached out through the usual channels and found his direct line silent, she was there. When the financial managers needed authorization on movement that was time-sensitive, she knew enough to speak the right language. When the three men who had stood closest to Taejin for a decade began asking questions, she did not answer those questions. She redirected them, one by one, towards separate concerns until the cohesion of their loyalty simply unwound. She did this in 31 days. She was thorough. And the man in the penthouse bedroom, whom she checked on twice through the simple act of stopping in the hallway and listening for the machinery, still running, still steady, was not a threat. He was not a factor. He was a condition of the transition that required only one thing from her, that he remain exactly where he was. Not dead. Dead created investigations. Dead created questions. Dead required documents and officials and the specific kind of scrutiny that Seoul had spent years learning how to operate outside of. Alive but silent was the better architecture. Let the machines breathe for him. Let the room take care of itself. Reduce the input. Reduce the contact. Let the staff's discomfort do the work of keeping the isolation intact. And let whatever biology intended for a man in his condition move at its own pace, unhurried, unmonitored, undisturbed. She had given it no specific timeline. She was patient. The camera footage from day 47 reached her at 7:43 in the morning. She was at the desk in what had been Taejin's private office. The desk he had used was replaced. She worked from a different piece, narrower, which she preferred, going through the financial review that the morning courier had delivered when the security monitor in the corner of the room shifted her attention. The domestic agency worker, the new hire from 2 days prior. The one whose intake form Seoul had not personally reviewed because the agency had become a background operation that she'd had no specific reason to scrutinize. She watched the footage for 45 seconds. The bowl, the spoon, the way the woman positioned the chair, moved it closer without being asked, the way she leaned forward and spoke to him, and then the part that made Seoul set down the document she was holding. He blinked. She watched it again, then a third time. Leaning slightly forward in the chair, her reading glasses still on, her coffee cup untouched. Taejin blinked twice, on request, clearly and deliberately, with the focused control of a man who knew exactly what he was communicating. The woman feeding him had straightened up after that blink with something new in her posture. Not surprise, not fear. Something that looked more like decision. Like she had asked a question and received an answer, and the answer had locked something into place for her. That was the part that required Seoul's attention, not the feeding. A domestic worker with misplaced compassion was manageable. People had impulses toward the suffering. That was a human deficiency she had accommodated for in other situations. You either redirected it or removed the person and it resolved itself. What required attention was that the woman had thought to ask the question in the first place. Most people who entered that room carried a prior assumption that whatever was behind those open eyes was unreachable. Seoul had not explicitly planted that assumption. She had simply not contradicted it, which had the same effect. The medical language used in the few communications she had permitted about his condition was vague enough to imply diminished consciousness without stating it. It was a gap she had left open and allowed people to fill with their own conclusions. This woman had not filled the gap with a conclusion. She had filled it with a question. That was a different cognitive posture entirely. Seoul removed her glasses, set them beside the coffee cup, looked at the frozen frame of the footage, the woman's face, clear and direct, leaning toward the bed with a spoon in her hand and no fear in her expression whatsoever. She reached for her phone. The head of building security, a compact and efficient man who understood that his job description in this building had changed recently and had adapted accordingly, answered on the second ring. "The new domestic hire on the penthouse floor," Seoul said. "I want her full intake file on my desk within the hour, and pull her agency background documentation, the original, not the summary." She paused. "And increase the camera coverage in that room. I want 4 angles." She ended the call and looked back at the monitor. The woman was still there. The footage was live now, not recorded. Sitting in the chair beside the bed, the empty bowl set aside, talking. Her mouth was moving steadily, quietly, in the way of someone having a one-sided conversation with complete comfort. Like she had done this before, like talking to someone who could not respond was not strange to her. That detail caught in Seoryeon's mind like a splinter. She filed it, and somewhere in the building above her, Zariah Cole was talking about London. She talked about the flat she'd grown up in. 3rd floor, no lift, the radiator that made a sound like something knocking for rescue every time the heat kicked on. She talked about the market 2 streets over where her mother used to buy yams on Saturdays and argue cheerfully with the vendor about the price every single week, despite the price never changing. She talked without looking for a response, and Taejin, who had not heard a human being speak to him, rather than about him or around him in 47 days, lay still and listened, with everything he had, which was still, despite everything, more than anyone in that building understood. Here's what nobody in that building was asking. Why wasn't she afraid of him? Every other staff member avoided eye contact. She moved a chair closer. What do you think she already knew? Tell us below. The intake file arrived on Seoryeon's desk at 8:51 a.m. She opened it, read the name, read the listed background, read the agency reference letters, which were thorough and professional, and told her exactly nothing useful. She turned to the final page, the one that contained the photograph taken at intake, looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone again. This time she did not call the security chief. She called a different number, one that was not saved under any name, and when the line connected, she said only, "Find out who she actually is." 3 floors above, in a room that now smelled faintly of warm rice and barley tea, Zariah Cole had stopped talking about London. She had started talking about her mother. And she had not yet noticed that when she said her mother's name, the man in the bed had done something he had not done in 47 days. He had closed his eyes. Chapter 5. She almost did not take the job. That was the part Zariah Cole would think about later. Much later, when everything had changed and the shape of what she had walked into had become clear. The part where she had almost said no. The agency had called her on a Wednesday. The placement was short notice, they said. The location was a private residence in a high-security building in Gangnam. The client required someone with experience in care support work, specifically with patients who had limited mobility. The pay was above standard rate. The hours were straightforward. There was a pause on the line. "Or is there anything else I should know about the placement?" she had asked. "The household runs quietly," the agent had said. "They value discretion." That was the phrase that almost turned her around. Every bad situation she had ever walked into in her career. And there had been a few, because domestic work in private households had a specific category of difficulty that people who had not done it did not understand, had been preceded by someone describing it as quiet and valuing discretion. It was the polite language for, "We are not going to tell you what you are actually walking into, and we expect you to absorb whatever that is without discussing it externally." But she was 3 months into Seoul, and the financial math of 3 months had not gone the way she had hoped. And the apartment she was renting in Mapogu had a landlord who was beginning to have pointed conversations with her about the upcoming month. She said yes. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself 2 weeks, maybe 3, and she would assess. She had been in Seoul for reasons she did not explain to the agency, and did not explain to her landlord, and had not explained to anyone in her life except her older sister back in London, who had listened to the whole thing over a video call that lasted 2 hours and had at the end of it said, very quietly, "Zariah, be careful." She had not promised anything. The building, when she first arrived, told her a great deal in the 30 seconds before she entered it. The security at the entrance was not the security of a building that worried about theft. It was the security of a building that worried about information. 2 different things, expressed in 2 entirely different ways that you learned to read if you paid attention. The cameras were high-end and numerous. The guard who checked her credentials did so thoroughly, without the apologetic quickness of someone who was performing a formality. He took his time. He looked at her properly. She let him. She had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to make security personnel nervous was to seem nervous about the security. The penthouse floor was quiet in a way that had texture to it, the specific texture of a place where normal human sounds had been deliberately removed. No television sounds through doors, no conversation drifting down hallways. The cleaning staff she passed moved with their heads down and their energy contained, the way people move in hospitals or libraries or places where the atmosphere has communicated. Somehow that sound costs something. The head of the domestic staff, a woman named Mrs. O, precise and minimal in the way of someone who had worked in high-end private households for decades, had walked her through the floor with the efficient brevity of someone relaying facts without context. She showed her the supply room, the staff kitchen, the schedule of tasks for the floor. She mentioned the patient's room in the third sentence, in the middle of a list, the way you bury the actual subject of a conversation inside surrounding content. The room at the end of the hall requires basic maintenance checks, linen replacement when needed, surface cleaning, ensuring the area remains sanitary. That was it. Zariah had waited. Mrs. O moved on. There is a medical team that manages clinical care. Domestic staff do not interface with that function. She waited again. The patient should be considered resting. Interaction is not part of your scope. The first time she entered the room, it was to replace the linen on the armchair in the corner, a task that required perhaps 2 minutes, and that served, she understood, as the permitted reason to be in the room without it constituting direct patient care. She had done it quickly, kept her eyes on the task, but she had looked. She had looked the way she looked at everything, all the way, not part way, without performing the not looking that everyone else in that building had rehearsed so thoroughly. She had taken in the room, the machines, the figure in the bed, the tray that had food on it, cold, untouched, old enough that the surface of the porridge had separated. She had kept her face neutral and walked out. That night, in her small apartment in Mapogu, she had lain on her bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she had seen. She was good at that, at sitting with a thing she had observed and letting it mean what it meant without talking herself into a different interpretation. She did not talk herself into any interpretation about the tray. She just let it be what it was. Then she thought about her mother. Not connected to the tray, not yet, just the way she often thought about her mother when she was alone in a foreign city and something had unsettled her. Zariah Cole had been the kind of woman who made the air in a room change when she walked in, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the specific way of a person who noticed everything and said something, eventually, about what they noticed. She had been a journalist. She had been very good at it. She had been specifically good at the kind of journalism that required following something that people with power would have preferred she left alone. She had left London for Los Angeles when Zariah was 11. She had stopped answering her phone when Zariah was 16. The official record, such as it was, said medical cause, a rapid illness, a death that was documented and filed and given a paper trail that answered the who and the what and the when, but never in any of the documents or the subsequent inquiries that Zariah's aunt had pursued for 3 years before running out of money and strength, never fully answered the why. The why had a name, eventually. It had taken Zariah 12 years of adult life, built around a career that allowed her to move between countries and households and circles of wealth in ways that raised no specific suspicion, to get close enough to that name to hear it clearly. Kwon Taejin. She had heard it first through a journalist contact who operated in the spaces between Korean organized crime and corporate infrastructure, a dangerous place to operate, which was why he operated it quietly from Budapest and communicated in layers. He had told her, 18 months ago, that the chain of events surrounding her mother's last investigation, which had been tracking the intersection of a Los Angeles shipping operation and Korean financial interests, traced back to one person's decision. One person who had the reach to make a person in Los Angeles become uncomplicated. That was the word he used. Uncomplicated. Zariah had sat in a cafe in Budapest and drunk her coffee and listened and kept her expression completely still. She had asked one question at the end. Is he findable? Her contact had laughed, not unkindly. He doesn't need to be found. He's the kind of man who stays in the same city his whole life because the city rearranges itself around him. Seoul. She had arrived 3 months ago with a plan that was less a plan and more a direction. Get close, get into the circles that intersected with his, find something solid enough to take somewhere that mattered. She had not expected the agency call. She had not expected the building or the floor or the room at the end of the hallway. She had especially not expected the man in the bed. She had expected Kwon Taejin to look like what she had carried in her mind for 12 years, constructed from photographs in documents and the weight of what he represented. A force, something that held its shape because of what it contained. What she found was a man staring at a ceiling. A man with cold food beside him that nobody had bothered to take away. A man whose eyes moved when she entered the room, tracked her, assessed her, with an intelligence and awareness that was unmistakable and that clearly nobody else in this building was paying enough attention to notice. And here was the thing that Zariah Cole would not fully examine until much later. She had not felt what she expected to feel. She had expected, if she ever got close to this name, to feel the specific cold rage that had lived under her sternum for years. The one that activated when she let herself think about her mother, about the phone calls that stopped, about the file her aunt had eventually handed her in a London kitchen with hands that were shaking slightly. She felt something else. She felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure, a shift, something that had no language yet but that she recognized as significant the way you recognize that the ground is about to change texture even before your foot makes contact. She could not explain it. She fed him. She came back the second morning with warm porridge and barley tea, and she sat in the chair she had pulled close, and she spoke to him the way she had spoken to her mother in the last year of her life. When the phone connection was bad, and she couldn't tell if she was being heard clearly, but she spoke anyway because silence was worse. She told him small things, the market in Mapogu, the way the rain in Seoul smelled different from the rain in London, the specific sound the radiator in her apartment made. She did not tell him why she was really there. Not yet. But somewhere in the 37th minute of that conversation, when the room was quiet and the machines breathed and the morning light came through the floor-to-ceiling glass in long, flat sheets across the white floor, she said a name, without planning it. Just said it. Her mother's name. And stopped. Why do you think she said it? Accident? Or was some part of her already testing him? Leave your answer below. We're reading every single one. She stopped because something had happened in the room. The quality of the silence changed. Or she changed inside the silence, which is not the same thing but feels identical from the inside. She looked at him, and what she saw was not the steady, contained, assessing expression that had been in his eyes every time she had looked at him across these 2 days. What she saw was something breaking through, fast, involuntary, the way things move when they have been held back by will alone, and the will is suddenly insufficient. His eyes widened. Not much, a fraction. The way a door moves when there is pressure behind it that was not there a moment ago. She went completely still in the chair. The spoon in her hand did not move. And for a long moment in that room, with the machines breathing steadily and the soul mourning spreading across the floor, the two of them looked at each other across a silence that had just become the loudest thing either of them had ever sat inside. Chapter 6. A day's Cole had a rule about sources. She told it to Zariah when Zariah was 9 years old, not as a journalism lesson, not deliberately, but in the way mothers sometimes hand their children the most important things they know by accident, mid-conversation, while doing something else entirely. They had been in the kitchen of the Peckham flat, Adize making jollof rice and talking through something she was working on, and Zariah had been on the counter watching. Because that was where Zariah always was when her mother was in a room. "You know how you can tell a source is worth trusting?" her mother had said, stirring the pot without looking at her. Zariah had said she didn't know. "They're afraid," Adize said. "Not of you, of what they're telling you. A source who isn't afraid of the information isn't a source. They're a messenger. Messengers carry things. Sources carry cost." Zariah had not fully understood it at 9. She had understood it completely by 23, when she was working entry-level at a small investigative outlet in London, and a source had come to her contact inbox with something that shook in every sentence. A person so clearly afraid of the information they were delivering that the fear itself was the first form of verification. She had thought about that rule many times in the years since. She had thought about it specifically in the 18 months since Budapest, as she moved through the careful geometry of getting close to a name without alerting the name that she was moving toward it. She thought about what her mother would have said about the approach, about the patience required, about the specific loneliness of building something that could not be shared with anyone because the moment it was shared, it became compromised. She had thought about it this morning, in the room, when she said her mother's name. And she thought about it now, in the staff kitchen, with the empty bowl in the sink and her hands around a cup of instant coffee that she was not drinking, because her hands needed to be around something while her mind moved through what she had just seen. His eyes. She had been a careful observer her entire life. It was the thing she had inherited most directly from Adize, not just the impulse to look, but the discipline of looking all the way through rather than stopping at the surface presentation of a thing. She had looked at Kwon Taejin across these 2 days with that same discipline, and she had built a picture of him that was, she thought, more accurate than anything the people in this building were working from. He was fully aware. He processed everything he saw and heard. He was not diminished. He was contained. And she had watched, from a precise distance of less than 4 feet, the moment her mother's name entered his consciousness and did something to him that he could not prevent, could not regulate. The eyes of a man who had spent his entire life making himself unreadable had, for one unguarded second, become completely transparent. He recognized the name. That was not surprise. Surprise had a different texture. It expanded, opened outward. What she had seen was something that contracted. Something that went inward fast, the way a person goes inward when something they have been carrying stops being theoretical and becomes present. Recognition, yes, but also something else. Something that, if she had seen it on anyone else's face, she would have named without hesitation. She stood in the staff kitchen and held her cup, and was very precise with herself about what she was doing, which was trying to decide whether what she had seen deserved the name she was almost giving it. She decided it did. Guilt. She had seen guilt. The flat in Peckham had 2 bedrooms. Zariah's room was small, a child's room, with the specific scale of a space that had been converted from storage into sleeping quarters with just enough effort to make it functional and no more. The window faced the building behind them, which meant the light was always second-hand. She had not minded. She had a lamp, and she had her books, and she had the sounds of her mother working at the kitchen table after midnight, the keyboard, the occasional phone call in a low voice, the click of the kettle. Those sounds were her sense of safety. When Adize went to Los Angeles for the first time, Zariah was 11. Staying with her aunt in Brixton, she had been gone for 2 weeks. When she came back, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that Zariah could have articulated at 11, but she had watched her mother the way she watched everything, and she noticed that the phone calls had become more guarded. The working after midnight sounds had acquired a different quality, a tension that had not been there before. She came back twice more, 3 trips to Los Angeles across 14 months. After the 3rd trip, she stayed. Just for a while, she told Zariah on a call from a number Zariah didn't recognize. There are things here I need to see through. Zariah was 12. She said okay. That was the last conversation they had that felt normal. The calls became shorter, more careful, A sometimes clearly conducted from a location that was not the number she had been given. Her aunt began picking up the phone on her behalf when Zariah called the apartment number, saying a days was out, was working, would call back. The callbacks became occasional and then rare. Zariah was 14 when her aunt sat her down at the kitchen table in Brixton and said the thing with the specific stillness of a person who has rehearsed a sentence many times and is delivering it now because there is no longer any other option. The illness had been fast. The documentation was in order. A lawyer in Los Angeles had handled the estate, such as it was. There was nothing to question. Zariah had sat at that table and absorbed this information with the face of a 14-year-old and the interior of someone much older, which was the consequence of having spent 3 years in the constant low company of a feeling she could not name. A feeling that her mother's absence was not the kind of absence that had a clean explanation. She had not cried. She had asked to see the documentation. Her aunt had looked at her for a moment, then gone to the cabinet above the refrigerator and taken down a folder. That was where Zariah Cole's actual education had begun. 12 years later, standing in a staff kitchen in a high-security building in Gangnam with a cup of cold instant coffee and a name sitting in her chest like a stone that had finally found the surface it was meant for. 12 years of building toward this, of developing the skills and the cover and the patience to get inside the geography of the man whose decision had reorganized her entire life. She was confronted with something she had not prepared for. He was not what she had built him to be. She had built him to be a force, a system, a thing that operated outside of the accountability structures that governed ordinary people, that moved through consequences without being touched by them. She had built him the way you build a target, with just enough specificity to aim at, without enough detail to confuse the aim. And then she had walked into a room and found a man who could not move, who had not been fed, who was lying in his own suffering with full awareness of every minute of it, and who had, when she said her mother's name, looked at her with something in his eyes that was not a system, that was human. She did not know what to do with that. She was not naive enough to think that suffering dissolved what he had done. She had covered enough ground in 12 years to understand that people could be fully human and fully culpable at the same time, that guilt and participation were not contradictions, that a man could carry regret and still have made every choice that led to the moment that required it. She understood all of that, but understanding it and standing in a room with it were different situations. And she was standing in the room. She put the cup down. She thought about what her mother would have said. Not the journalist advice, the other kind. The kind Adaze gave when the situation was personal rather than professional, which happened less often but mattered more. You don't have to decide everything right now, baby. You just have to decide the next true thing. The next true thing. She stood at the sink and looked out the small kitchen window at the slice of Seoul morning visible between 2 buildings, a rectangle of gray-blue sky, a ledge with a single pigeon on it, a piece of someone else's normal day continuing without any awareness of what was happening in this building. The next true thing was that she knew who he was. The next true thing was that he had recognized her mother's name in a way that confirmed everything she had spent 12 years trying to verify. The next true thing was that she had 2 choices. She could make a decision right now, today, this morning, and with everything that she carried about her mother and the folder her aunt had handed her, and the 12 years and the Budapest Cafe and all of it. And that decision would be fast and driven by what she felt, which was very old and very heavy. Or she could keep coming back to that room, keep feeding him, keep talking, and wait. Because he could communicate now. 2 blinks, yes. That was 1 word, essentially. But it was a word. And a man who had 1 word could eventually build toward 2. Toward a sentence. Toward everything that Zariah had actually come to Seoul to find. Not just the confirmation that he had done it. The proof. The kind that could go somewhere. The kind that could mean something outside of this building, outside of her own private grief. She could wait. She picked up the cup, poured it out, rinsed it. Walked back down the hallway toward the room at the end. She did not know that on Seoryan's desk, at this exact moment, her intake photograph was being looked at by a woman who was very good at reading information and who had just made a phone call to find out who Zariah Cole actually was. She did not know the clock had started. She only knew the next true thing. Her mother told her, "Sources carry cost. What do you think Zariah is about to cost? And what do you think she's willing to pay? Comment below. We want to know." The photograph on Seoryan's desk was a standard intake shot. Professional, neutral, the kind of image that communicated reliable and unremarkable without trying to. It told Seoryan nothing specific, but the agency background documentation had a gap, narrow, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully, in the employment history between 18 months ago and now. A gap that corresponded to no listed country, no listed employer, no listed reason. For most candidates, gaps like that meant nothing. For most candidates, Seoryan would not have looked twice, but most candidates did not walk into a patient's room and think to ask him a question. She set the photograph down, opened her laptop. The man she had called, the one with no name saved to the contact, called back in 22 minutes. He confirmed the identity. He confirmed the background. And then he said one more thing. One thing he had found in the wider search, in the layer beneath the layer, in the place where information lived that was not meant to be found. He said it in a sentence. Seoryan listened, did not react, thanked him, ended the call, sat for a long moment looking at the middle distance. Then she said, to no one. She has no idea. Chapter 7. 3 weeks passed. Not quietly. Quietly implied an absence of event, and these 3 weeks were full, dense with small things that accumulated the way pressure accumulates, invisible until the moment it becomes undeniable. Zariah came back every day. She came the way she did everything, without announcement, without performance. She arrived, she heated food in the staff kitchen, she sat in the chair she had moved close to the bed and not moved back, and she fed him and talked to him with the steady, unhurried quality of someone who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. The staff watched, not directly. Nobody in that building was careless enough to do anything directly. But she felt it. The way a room changes when people are paying attention to you while appearing not to. The slight recalibration of bodies in hallways when she passed. The conversations that arrived at their natural ends a half-second earlier than they should have. Mrs. O had spoken to her on the 5th day, not instructively, socially, which was worse, because social correction was harder to respond to without seeming difficult. She had found Zariah in the supply room and made small talk about the schedule, and then said, as though it were incidental, "The patient's care is managed separately, of course. The clinical team coordinates all of that." Zariah had said, "Of course," and continued. Mrs. O had not repeated herself, which meant either she had decided the point had been made or she had decided the point was above her pay grade to enforce and had referred the matter to someone above her. Zariah assumed the latter. She assumed Seoryan knew. She had assumed that from day 2, from the moment she understood what the cameras in the room meant, which was not just documentation but monitoring, active monitoring, the kind that served a specific purpose in a household where power had recently changed hands and information was currency. Seoryan knew, and Seoryan had not, in 3 weeks, made any direct move. That was useful information. It meant either that Zariah's presence was not yet considered enough of a problem to address, or that Seoryan had calculated some advantage in letting it continue. She did not know which, so she proceeded as though both were possible and adjusted accordingly. She was consistent. She was visible in exactly the ways her role required and no more. And she was careful. But she did not stop going to the room, because something was happening. Taejin was changing, not physically. The change she had begun to notice, though she did not yet have a name for it. Something in the internal landscape. She could see it the way you see weather changing before it arrives, in a quality of light, in a shift in pressure. He watched her differently now than he had on the first day. Less like someone assessing an unknown variable, more like someone listening. She had noticed specifically that he cried. Not in the way people cry who are performing grief or trying to communicate distress. He cried the way people cry when something they have been holding for a long time finds a small exit without permission. She would be talking about something ordinary, about the city, about a story her mother had told her once. And she would look up, and there would be wetness at the outer corners of his eyes that he could not wipe away because he could not move his hands. She did not react. She continued. She understood in a way she had not expected to understand that calling attention to it would cost him something that he could not afford to lose. He had been stripped of most of his dignities by circumstance. She was not going to strip him of this one by acknowledging it when he had given no indication he wanted it acknowledged. It was the most controlled act of compassion she had ever performed. And she did not examine it too closely. Not yet. The two-blink language had expanded slowly into a small but functional vocabulary of coded response. 2 blinks for yes, 3 for no, 1 slow blink for something that he wanted her to hold rather than resolve immediately. She had found over time that the 1 slow blink appeared most often when she talked about her mother. Like he was carrying the conversation somewhere before responding to it, like he was deciding something. On day 3 of the 3rd week, she came in and found the food tray from the previous day still sitting on the granite table. Not because no one had been in. The room had been maintained, surfaces wiped, fresh linen on the chair. Just the tray had been left. She picked it up without comment, went to the kitchen, came back. She sat down. Looked at him for a moment. "I need you to understand something," she said. Quietly, the way she said everything in this room. He was watching her with the full attention that was, she had come to recognize, the one form of expression that no one had taken from him. "I know who you are," she said. "Not just your name, not just what this building is." She set the fresh bowl on the table. "I know about Los Angeles. I know about the work my mother was doing when she died." The room did not change. The machines breathed. She looked at him steadily. "I am not here to hurt you. I want you to know that. I'm not saying it because I need you to feel safe. I'm saying it because it's the only way what I'm doing here makes any sense to either of us." She picked up the spoon. "But I need you to know that I know. Because what comes next, the way this goes, that depends on what you're willing to do with the time you have left in this bed." She fed him a spoonful. He ate it without looking away from her face. "I'm going to keep coming back. Every day, and at some point you're going to be able to tell me what actually happened. Not just the confirmation, like the whole thing. What she found, what you decided, what happened after." Another spoonful. "And when you can tell me that, and I believe you will be able to because I've been watching you and something is changing, we're going to decide together what to do with it." She set the spoon down briefly. "Together," she said again, "because I have spent 12 years coming toward this, and I am not going to do something stupid with it just because I finally got here." He blinked. Once, slow. She picked the spoon back up. They stayed in that room for another 40 minutes. She fed him. She talked about smaller things, let the intensity of what she had said settle without pressing it further. Outside the glass, Seoul went about its enormous ordinary business of being a city, and in the upper corner of the room, the camera recorded all of it. 4 angles now, where there had been one. Every word she had just said was captured across 4 simultaneous feeds, time-stamped and stored in a system that Seoul's security team managed. But here was the thing about Zariah Cole that the intake photograph had not shown, and the background documentation had not captured, and the man with no saved name had not known to mention. She had known about the cameras before she said a single word. She had known because she had looked, on the first day, when she stood in that room with the cold tray and swept her gaze across the space in one clean inventory, and she had counted them, and she had noted the angles, and she had spent 3 weeks working out exactly what each angle could and could not see. And she had sat in the chair, in the one position in the room where the angle of her mouth relative to the bed was covered by only one camera. The one she had found on day 9 had a lens with the specific kind of mineral fogging that happened when cleaning solution dried on a surface without being fully wiped. She had tested it on day 11 by walking past it at different distances and different angles, watching the indicator light. She had spoken every word directly to that lens, and Seoryeon, watching the feeds, had seen her mouth move, but had not heard a single syllable. She planned the blind spot. From day 1, how long do you think she has been this careful? And what do you think she's actually prepared to risk? Tell us in the comments. The next chapter is where everything starts to move. At 4:47 that afternoon, on the monitor in the office 2 floors below, Seoryeon watched Zariah leave the room, walk down the hall, disappear into the staff kitchen. She watched the 4-angle feed of the empty room, the chair close to the bed, the bowl set aside, Taejin's eyes still focused on the point in the air where a woman's face had been. And for the first time since this had begun, Seoryeon felt something she did not often feel, something she recognized after a moment. Oh, as the specific alertness of a person who has just understood they may have made a miscalculation. She leaned forward, looked at the feed from camera 2, the one with the fogged lens that her team had flagged for replacement 3 weeks ago and had not yet replaced. Looked at the angle, looked at where the chair was positioned relative to it, sat back, and said nothing for a very long time. Chapter 8. The spoon hit the floor at 9:14 in the morning and nobody came. Zariah had set it on the edge of the tray while she reached to adjust the pillow support behind Taejin's head. A small repositioning, something she had learned to do carefully and without rushing. And her elbow caught the handle, and the spoon went down and rang against the stone floor with a sound that was too loud for the room, and then went quiet. She picked it up, went to the kitchen, rinsed it, came back. In the 40 seconds she was gone, nothing in the room changed. The machines breathed. The morning light held its angle across the floor. Taejin's eyes tracked the ceiling and then tracked her when she returned, following her from the door to the table to the chair with the specific quality of attention she had come to understand was not passive. He was always working. Even now. Even here. She settled back into the chair, adjusted the bowl, picked up the clean spoon. "Left hand," she said. She was not looking at him when she said it. She was looking at the bowl, measuring the temperature of the porridge with the back of her wrist the way she always did. "Yesterday, when I was talking, your left hand moved. Just the fingers. I don't think you knew I saw it." She looked up. His eyes were on her. "I'm not going to make a thing of it," she said. "I just want you to know that I saw it, and that it matters." She brought the spoon to his mouth. He ate. She fed him with the same unhurried rhythm she had developed across these weeks. Not fast, not slow, calibrated to what he could manage, with pauses that were long enough to be respectful and short enough not to become awkward. She had learned the specific geography of this by doing it, the way you learn most things that cannot be taught in advance. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Han River caught the morning in long silver fragments. "My mother used to say that the body remembers things the mind tries to forget," Zariah said. She meant it about trauma. About the way pain stores itself in places that aren't conscious. She set the spoon down for a moment. "I think it goes the other way, too. I think the body holds on to things the mind has given up on." She was not looking at him while she said this. She was looking at his left hand, which was resting on the linen beside his hip, and while she watched, the index finger moved. Not a tremor, not the involuntary micro-movements she had observed occasionally across the weeks. A deliberate extension, a reach that went nowhere but intended somewhere. She put the spoon down fully, reached into the pocket of her uniform jacket, and took out a small notebook and a pen. The kind of small, ordinary things that nobody in this building had any reason to confiscate from domestic staff. And she placed the open notebook flat on the bed beside his left hand. "Don't force it," she said. She picked up the bowl and resumed feeding him as though nothing had shifted. kept her voice even, kept the rhythm of the meal intact. The machines breathed, the river held its light. 4 minutes passed, then the finger moved again, slowly, with the concentrated effort of someone lifting something whose weight is enormous relative to what the movement looks like from the outside. The tip of his index finger traced a line on the paper. Stopped. Moved again. It was not a letter. Not yet. It was the shape of intention, a mark that communicated only that the making of marks was returning, that the connection between his mind and his hand was thinning back toward conductivity. Zariah looked at it, kept her face where it was. "Good," she said, just that. Then the next spoonful. This was the moment, though neither of them could have named it as such while inside it, that the balance of everything shifted. Not dramatically, not with the weight it deserved. The most consequential moments rarely announce themselves. They arrive inside ordinary circumstances: a spoon, a bowl, a notebook, a finger tracing a line on paper while morning light crosses a floor. But balance shifts were not the same as resolutions, because the camera in the upper corner of the room, the one whose fogged lens Zariah had been using strategically for 3 weeks, had been replaced. She did not know this yet. She had checked the indicator light on her way in. Old habit. It had read the same as always: present, recording, the specific blink pattern of a lens in full function. What she did not know was that the fogging had been addressed not by replacing the camera body, which would have been obvious, but by cleaning and recalibrating the existing lens in place, a task that took less than 4 minutes and left the camera in the same physical position with the same indicator behavior and a completely unobstructed view. Every word she said in that room was now fully captured. The notebook, the finger, the mark on the paper, the bowl, the spoon, the morning light. And Zariah's voice, saying "good" with a steadiness that, on the monitor 2 floors below, Maid looked like exactly what it was. A woman who had just watched a paralyzed man write his first mark in weeks and had chosen, with full deliberateness, not to react in any way that could be taken from him. Seorian watched the feed. She had been watching for 11 minutes. She did not move. Her coffee was cold beside her, untouched. The morning financial review was open on the desk and had not been read. She sat with her full attention on the monitor, in the way of someone who had spent considerable time deciding whether a thing was a problem and had just reached a conclusion. She picked up her phone. Not the encrypted one, the building's internal line. "I need a meeting," she said when it connected. "This afternoon, the 3 of us, my office." She set the phone down, looked at the monitor again. Zariah was gathering the empty bowl and the notebook, which she folded closed and put back in her pocket, and standing from the chair. She said something to him that the audio captured, but that Seorian did not immediately process because she was looking at the thing the camera showed her after Zariah turned toward the door. Taejin's left hand, still resting on the linen. The index finger extended slightly, and then, clearly, deliberately, with a control that had not existed yesterday, curled back in. A fist, small, incomplete, barely a fist, but a fist. Seorian looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the door through which Zariah had just exited, and she understood that the window she had believed was open indefinitely had just developed an edge. He made a fist. 6 weeks after they said he was unreachable. What do you think happens now that Seorian knows he's coming back? Drop your prediction in the comments, because the next chapter is the one nobody saw coming. The meeting happened at 3 in the afternoon. Seorian's office, which had once been Taejin's, smelled of black tea and printer paper and the specific neutral scent of a room from which all personality had been deliberately removed. 3 people sat in it. Seorian, the head of building security, and a man whose name was not written on any building directory and whose function in the organization had always been expressed in the vocabulary of problem resolution. She showed them the footage: the finger, the fist, the notebook in the pocket, the 3-week pattern of daily visits, the chair moved close, the one-sided conversations. The security chief asked a practical question about access restriction. The third man said nothing. Seorian looked at the frozen frame of Taejin's hand, the incomplete fist on the linen, and then she said, "That's not what I want." The security chief waited. "What I want," Seorian said, "is a conversation with her." She looked at both of them in turn. "Arrange it for tomorrow morning, before she goes upstairs." She stood, which meant the meeting was over. Make it feel like a coincidence. Chapter 9. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor at 7:58 in the morning, and Seorian was already there. Not waiting, that was the precision of it. She was moving through the lobby with the specific quality of motion that communicated purposeful transit, someone passing through rather than positioned and ready. But she looked up when the doors opened. Her expression moved through recognition and then settled into the warm, neutral register of an unexpected but not unwelcome encounter. "Ms. Cole," she said, like she had just remembered the name a half-second before using it. Zariah stepped out of the elevator. She had known this was coming. She had not known it would be this morning, or the lobby, or this specific choreography of apparent coincidence. But she had known it was coming. The way you know weather is coming when the air changes 3 hours before the rain. She had been waiting for it the way she waited for most things she anticipated, without visible anticipation. "Good morning," Zariah said. Seorian fell into step beside her, not blocking, not confronting. I'd just present in the way of someone who had a destination in the same direction and happened to be going there at the same time. "I wanted to speak with you," Seorian said, conversationally. "I hope you have a moment." "Of course." They walked. Seorian was wearing charcoal wool, the kind that moved like water when she walked, and her hair was pulled back in a way that communicated effortless order rather than visible effort, which Zariah recognized as the more sophisticated achievement. She was perhaps 40, possibly a year or two on either side. She smelled of something clean and expensive that had no specific name, but that you would recognize in any room it had recently occupied. "I appreciate the care you've shown on this floor," Seorian said. "It's been noticed." "I just do my job," Zariah said. "You do more than your job," Seorian said, not accusatory, almost warm, "which is actually what I wanted to speak with you about." They had arrived at the far end of the lobby, near the tall windows that overlooked the building's exterior garden, a narrow, deliberate space of black stone and shaped hedges. Seorian turned toward the view in the unhurried way of someone who had arrived at a destination rather than a confrontation. "You've formed a connection with the patient," Seorian said. Zariah said nothing. She looked at the garden. "I don't say that critically," Seorian continued. "Compassion is genuinely valuable in care work. The patient's situation is difficult and human contact matters in those situations. I understand that." She paused. However, there it was. Zariah had been waiting for the "however the way you wait for the second shoe." "The nature of Mr. Kwon's condition requires careful management," Seorian said. "There are medical and legal dimensions to his care that extend beyond what domestic staff would normally have visibility into. And I have a responsibility. To his estate, to his health protocols, to the people who have authorized me to oversee his care, to ensure those dimensions are respected." She turned from the window. "I know you care about him. That's clear." She said it with a generosity that was the most dangerous thing about the conversation. "But I'm asking you, formally, and I hope kindly, to keep your work within your defined scope. Surface maintenance, supply management, the things the agency placed you here to do." She smiled. It was a good smile. Oh, the kind that communicated reasonableness and goodwill and the assumption of shared understanding. "Does that make sense?" Seorian asked. Zariah looked at her, took the 3 seconds that a person who was genuinely processing a reasonable request would take, then said, "Absolutely. I appreciate you explaining the context." Seorian's expression did not change, but something beneath it did. Something in the region of her eyes that was not quite satisfaction and not quite surprise. Something that recalibrated. "Thank you," she said. "I thought you'd understand." She moved back toward the elevator bank. Zariah watched her go, then turned back to the garden window and stood there for a moment, looking at the black stone and the shaped hedges, processing what had just happened with the full attention it deserved. The conversation had been a warning. That was clear. But the specific shape of the warning told her something important. Seorion had not ordered her removed from the building. She had not restricted her access to the floor. She had not involved the agency or created a formal complaint. She had come down to the lobby personally at 8 in the morning and delivered a carefully constructed message that left every door technically open, which meant that removing Zariah entirely created a problem that keeping her, controlled, warned, redirected, did not. She thought about what problem that might be. A domestic worker who had been providing daily hands-on care to a patient and then abruptly disappeared could generate questions. From the agency, potentially from other parties. Depending on what those other parties knew and how they were connected to the building. Or it meant something else. It meant Seorion was not yet certain what Zariah knew. And removing her before understanding the full perimeter of that knowledge was a risk Seorion had decided not to take. Both possibilities told Zariah the same thing. She had more time. Not unlimited time, but more. She went upstairs. Taejin's room was exactly as she had left it the previous afternoon. The machines, the light, the chair angled toward the bed. She came in and he tracked her from the door the way he always did, and she pulled the chair close and sat down and said, "She spoke to me this morning." He blinked once. Slow. She was polite, Zariah said. She was very good at it. She set the bowl on the table, did not start feeding him yet. Just sat, elbows on knees, looking at him directly. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He waited. "Is there anyone left in this building who is still loyal to you? Someone who would not report upward if I approached them?" 3 blinks. No. She had expected that. "Is there anyone outside this building? Someone with access to your accounts or your communication records? Something that establishes what Seorion has moved since you went down?" He held her gaze, then blinked twice. "Yes." She let out a breath that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. "Can you give me a name? Something I can find. A person or a location?" His left hand moved. She had the notebook out before he had finished moving. She placed it and the pen under his fingers and waited. This was different from the first mark. That had been effort establishing the possibility of effort. This was intention. This was a man organizing something he needed to communicate. It took 11 minutes. What he produced was not cursive. It was not even fully formed letters in every case. Some were partial shapes that she had to complete by inference, the way you complete a word from context when a sound drops out. But it was legible. A name, a phone number, and one word beneath them, written with more pressure than the rest, the indentation of it visible from the other side of the page. Brother. Zariah looked at the word for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "You have a brother," she said. 2 blinks. "Who doesn't know you're here?" 2 blinks. "Who doesn't know any of this?" 2 blinks. She closed the notebook. She thought about what this meant, the specific geometry of it. A person outside the building with no awareness of the current situation and no access to the information Seorion controlled. A person who, if contacted correctly, could become a point of entry into everything that had been moved and rerouted and rearranged in the weeks since a man collapsed at a party. And the woman who arranged it began making decisions about what the world was allowed to know. She thought about the camera above her left shoulder, which was no longer fogged, which she had realized yesterday, on her way out, when the light caught the lens at a different angle than usual, had been cleaned. Which meant Seorion had everything from yesterday forward. The name on the paper, the number, the word brother. She looked at Taejin. "She already knows," Zariah said quietly. He looked at her. She said, "We have to move faster than she does." His left hand moved again. She put the notebook back. He wrote 2 more words. She read them, sat back. For the first time since she had walked into this building, something moved through Zariah Cole's chest that was not grief and was not calculation. It was the specific feeling of a door opening onto a room that you have been standing outside for 12 years. The 2 words he had written were, "Trust me." He asked her to trust him. The man who destroyed her family. What would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments, because this decision changes everything that comes after. The notebook was in her jacket pocket when she walked out of the room at 9:47 that morning. What she did not know, could not have seen from her position in the chair, was that the camera now had a full, unobstructed view of the notebook's surface, that the resolution on the new lens was sufficient, that Seoul's security team, reviewing the footage at 10:15, had zoomed to the page and enhanced it and read every word. The name, the number, the word that mattered most. And that at 10:23, a call went out from the building's internal system to a number that was not saved under any name. And the instruction delivered in that call was 4 words long, spoken without emotion, and acted on within the hour. By the time Zariah Cole took her lunch break at noon and found a quiet stairwell and took out the notebook and reached for her phone, the number written beneath the name had already been disconnected. Chapter 10. The line rang twice and went to a recorded message in Korean. Zariah pulled the phone from her ear, looked at the number, dialed again. Same result. She stood in the stairwell with the notebook open in one hand and the phone in the other, and let herself be completely still for 10 seconds. Not panicking, not reacting, just absorbing the information fully before deciding what to do with it. The number was dead, which meant one of 2 things. Either it had been dead for a long time and Taejin did not know, because the last time he had spoken to his brother, the number had been active, or it had been disconnected recently, deliberately. In the window of time between when she left the room and when she found this stairwell, she knew which one it was. She put the phone away, put the notebook away, looked at the stairwell wall, concrete, institutional, lit by a single fixture, and thought. Seoul had moved faster than she anticipated, not because she had been careless, because the camera variable had closed on her without warning, and she had not yet had time to adapt to that closure before the information she needed was already compromised. She went back upstairs. Taejin saw her face when she came through the door, and she saw him register it. He was the kind of man, had been the kind of man, had built an entire empire on being the kind of man, who read rooms in the first 2 seconds and extracted more from the information available than most people could extract in 10 minutes. The paralysis had not touched that. She sat down. Ok said, "The number is disconnected." His expression did not change in the way of someone receiving news. It changed in the way of someone confirming something they had already begun to suspect in the gap between her leaving and her returning. He blinked once. Slow. She understood. He was not surprised. "She had the camera cleaned," Zariah said. "Sometime in the last 2 days. The fog on the lens is gone. Everything from yesterday is captured." He held her gaze. "I need to find another way to reach him," she said. "The name you gave me, is there a physical location? Somewhere he actually is, not just a phone?" His hand moved toward the notebook. She had it out immediately. What he wrote this time took longer. His hand was steadier than yesterday, but stamina was still a limited resource. She could see the effort in the slight tremor that appeared in the 3rd minute, and the way the letters near the end of the address were smaller, compressed, as though he was managing a budget of physical precision that was running low. A neighborhood, a business name, Mapogu, 2 streets from her apartment. She looked at that for a moment without comment, then looked at him. "He has a business there?" 2 blinks. "Does he know about you? What happened to you?" 3 blinks. "No." "Does he know about Seoul?" 3 blinks. She sat back and looked at the ceiling briefly, a gesture she rarely allowed herself in this room, an uncontained moment, and then came back to level. "Okay," she said. "This is what I need to figure out. Z's, if I go to this address, I am walking out of this building during a window where every move I make is being watched. She knows I had this notebook. She knows I made a call that didn't connect. She is waiting to see what I do next. She looked at him. If I go directly, I hand her the connection between you and your brother before we have any advantage from it. If I don't go, we lose whatever window exists before she finds him through other means. He blinked once. Slow. Holding. She watched him. His hand moved, small, deliberate. He wrote one word. Tonight. She understood. Not during the building's active hours, not under the full weight of daytime surveillance and staff presence. The building at night had fewer eyes, and her schedule as domestic staff, it did not require her to sign out or log a departure time once her shift ended at 6. She was not a prisoner here. That was still true. She nodded. Then she picked up the bowl. Because feeding him was still the cover, and the cover still mattered, and because she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this, she had come to understand that the feeding was not only operational, that the thing she did in this room every day had become something she did not have a clean name for, which occupied a space that her purpose in coming to Seoul had not reserved. I'm going to talk to him tonight, she said, not as a question. 2 blinks. And if he's willing to help, if there's documentation, financial records, anything that establishes the timeline of what she's moved, we bring it to someone outside this building. 2 blinks. And then you're going to have to talk. Not blinks, actual words. Whatever comes back in that hand needs to come back in your voice too, because testimony without a voice is harder to anchor. He looked at her. She waited. His left hand was resting on the linen. She watched it for a moment. Then the thing she had been watching happen for 3 weeks completed itself in a way she had not prepared for. He spoke. Not a word. Not a formed, complete word with consonants and full vowel shape. More like the raw material of a word, a sound that had the architecture of intention behind it, pushed through a voice that had been completely silent for nearly 2 months, with the specific hoarse, cracked quality of something long unused finding its mechanism again. It sounded like the beginning of her name. She went absolutely still. He tried again. It was closer, and then, with the focused effort of a man who had spent his entire life making precision into an instrument, he produced it. Za. A pause. Raya. 2 syllables. Broken. Barely voiced. Like gravel under a door, but unmistakable. She sat in the chair and looked at him, and for the first time in the weeks she had been in this room, she did not manage her expression into the controlled neutral she had learned to maintain. Something in her face shifted in a way she did not stop. Not softness exactly. Something more like recognition. The specific thing that happens when you have been holding a structure in place for so long that when one part of it finally releases, the rest of the structure shudders. She breathed. That was your name, she said. 2 blinks. Say it again. He did. Clearer this time. Still damaged, still rough, still miles from the voice that had once moved through boardrooms and private gatherings and the specific sonic architecture of power. But there, present, his. She set the spoon down and sat in the chair for a moment with her hands open in her lap, looking at him, looking at her, and neither of them said anything. Then she said, 3 days. That's what I need. Tonight I go to your brother. If he has what we need, 3 days to get it into the right hands, can you hold? 2 blinks. You're going to keep improving. Don't let anyone here see it. Not yet. Whatever comes back in that voice, whatever comes back in that hand, it belongs to us until we're ready. He blinked once, holding. Then, with the effort of a man rationing something precious, he produced 3 more sounds. She leaned forward. He said it again. She understood. What he said, in the broken new voice that was still learning how to be a voice again, was, I'm sorry. And the thing about that was, she had been waiting for it for 12 years. She had built a specific architecture around what those words would mean to her when she finally got them. She had imagined she would feel like a door opening, like a knot releasing, like a crossing of something that had been holding her in place. What she actually felt was more complicated and more honest and less resolved than any of that. She felt the weight of it, the full, real weight of what it cost him and what it cost her and what it still did not fix and what it never would fix and what it had opened between them anyway. Something that had no clean name, that lived in the space between accountability and grief, between too late and not yet enough. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I know." She fed him the rest of the bowl. She stayed for 40 minutes. When she stood to leave, she put the notebook in her pocket and looked at him one more time. He was watching her with the same full attention as always, but something in it was different now. The quality of a person who has put something down that they have been carrying alone for a long time. The specific, unfamiliar lightness of that. She walked to the door. He said her name one more time as she reached for the handle. Softer this time, not calling her back, just marking the moment, the way you mark something you know is going to matter. She did not turn around. She walked out. And in the office, 2 floors below, Seoryeon sat in front of the monitor and watched the door of the room close behind Zariah Cole and understood, with the absolute certainty of a person who had not become what she was without learning to read the information a room produced before, during, and after any significant event, that something had happened in there today that the camera had seen, and she had not. She looked at Taejin's face on the monitor. Still, composed, eyes tracking the ceiling above the bed. She had looked at that face for 2 months, and today, for the first time, she could not read it. That was new. He said her name. Then he said he was sorry. After 12 years and everything she came to Seoul to do, what would you have said back? Tell us in the comments. And stay close. Because tomorrow Zariah walks into a mapo-gu business with a name on a piece of paper and a clock that has already started. At 5:59 that afternoon, 1 minute before her shift ended, Zariah signed out on the ground floor staff log, the same time she had signed out every day since she arrived. She walked to the mapo-gu subway entrance 4 blocks east and took the line 2 stops and walked the rest of the way to her apartment building. She did not go up. She stood in the lobby for 45 seconds, checking her phone, then walked back out and turned left. The business Taejin had written was 6 minutes away on foot. She had timed it. What she did not know, and would not know until she was already inside, was that the man she was about to meet had been expecting someone to come. Not her specifically, not this week specifically, but someone. Because 3 days ago, through a channel she could not have traced and he had not yet explained, he had received a message. No name, no context, just 4 words. The message said, "She will come." Chapter 11. The sign above the door said Kwon Automotive Repair in faded Korean lettering, and the lights inside were on. Zariah pushed through the door at 6:47 p.m., and the smell hit her immediately. Machine oil, rubber, the metallic bass note of a working garage. 2 cars were lifted on the racks. A radio played something low and staticky from somewhere in the back. A man appeared from behind the far vehicle. He was younger than Taejin, not by much, maybe 4 years, maybe 5. He was shorter, broader across the shoulders, wearing a navy coverall with grease on the forearms and the specific physical ease of someone who worked with their hands for a living and had long stopped being conscious of it. He had the same dark eyes as his brother. The resemblance was not identical, but it was present in the way a key resembles a lock, not the same shape, but clearly related to the same architecture. He looked at her. She said, "My name is Zariah Cole. I work in your brother's building." He was still for a moment. Then he set down the tool he was holding on the nearest surface and pulled a rag from his coverall pocket and wiped his hands, slowly, looking at her the whole time. Not with hostility, with the careful assessment of a man who had received a message 4 days ago that he had not told anyone about. He said, "Is he alive?" "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that had clearly been held for a long time. Not dramatically. He was not the dramatic type. She could see that immediately. Just a breath releasing something that had been compressed under pressure for weeks. "Come inside," he said. His name was Kwon Taejin. He had known something was wrong the same week it happened. Taejin had missed a call, which alone meant nothing. But then he had missed 3 more across the following week, and the text messages Taejin sent to his private line received no response, and when he called the building directly, the person who answered was not the assistant he had spoken to a dozen times before. A new voice, professional and pleasant, told him that Mr. Kwon was not available and offered to take a message. The message had not been returned. Taejin had gone to the building once, and 2 weeks after the gathering. He had not been allowed past the lobby. The security at the door had been polite and absolute, and there had been a woman, he described her precisely, and Zariah recognized the description, who had come down to the lobby personally to tell him that Taejin was resting and not accepting visitors at this time, and that she would ensure his concern was communicated. She had said it with such clean, warm assurance that Taejin had spent the walk back to Mapogu telling himself that maybe he was wrong. Maybe there was a legitimate medical situation being managed carefully. Maybe Taejin had made choices about his recovery that required isolation. He had told himself that for 5 weeks. It had been getting harder to believe. "Show me," Zariah said. "Whatever you have that's connected to him, accounts, it's documents, communications, anything that was going through you that normally went through him directly." He looked at her. "Why would things go through me?" he said. "Because you're the one person in his life who existed entirely outside the structure he built," she said. "Which means if he was going to put something somewhere it couldn't be easily found or rerouted by someone who knew that structure, he would have put it with you." Taejin was quiet. Then he stood up from the stool he had taken in the small office adjacent to the garage floor, a room that smelled of paper and motor oil and old coffee, and went to the cabinet above the desk. Metal, gray, the kind that locked with a key he kept on the same ring as his car keys. He opened it. Inside were 2 envelopes, brown, standard size, his brother's handwriting on the front. He put them on the desk in front of her. "He gave me these 11 months ago," Taejin said. "He said not to open them. He said if he ever asked me directly to open them, I should open them. He said if someone came to me who knew about the envelopes, that was the same as him asking." He paused. "He said, specifically, that I should trust the person who came, that the fact they knew about the envelopes would be how I'd know." Zariah looked at the envelopes. She looked at him. "He didn't tell you there were envelopes," Taejin said. "Did he?" She said, he told me to find you. He didn't tell me about these." Taejin looked at her for a long time. The garage sounds came through the wall, the radio, the distant drip of something, the city outside moving through its evening. "Then how did you know to say that?" he said. "About things going through me," she said. "Because I've been in a room with him every day for 4 weeks, and I've been listening." Taejin was quiet again. Then he slid both envelopes across the desk. She opened the first one. Financial records, printed rather than digital. A deliberate choice that she recognized immediately. Physical documents could not be accessed remotely, could not be deleted from a server, could not be rerouted by someone who had gained control of an account. Account numbers, transaction logs, routing histories across 4 separate entities, dates going back 18 months, and annotated in the margins in Taejin's handwriting, small, precise, the handwriting of a man who understood that notes needed to survive independent of context, explanations of what each transaction represented and who had authorized it. The second envelope was a single folded document, longer, a letter, written by hand. She read the first paragraph and stopped. She read it again. Then she set it down on the desk and looked at the garage wall and processed, without expression, what she had just understood. The letter was not about Seoul. It was not about the financial records or the network or the empire being rerouted. The letter was about her mother. Taejin had written it 11 months ago, a year before Zariah arrived in Seoul, before the building, before the agency call, before any of it. He had known she was coming, not how, not when, but he had known that eventually someone would. He had written the letter anyway, and in it, he had written everything. He wrote the letter 11 months ago, before she ever arrived. What does that tell you about what he knew and what he was already preparing for? We're reading every comment. Tell us what you think. She sat in the office of Kwon Automotive Repair until 9:20 that night. Tae-soo made coffee that was too strong and sat across from her, and they read the documents together. She translated what she needed him to understand. He confirmed the details of the accounts he recognized from conversations with his brother across years. By the end of it, they had a picture. Complete, documented, verifiable. A chain from a decision made in Los Angeles 14 years ago to a balance sheet in Seoul in the present week. Yet she folded the documents into the inside pocket of her jacket. She looked at Tae-soo. He asked, "What do we do with it?" She said, "Tonight, nothing. Tomorrow I go back upstairs." He said, "Is that safe?" She thought about that. Then she said, "He trusts me too." Tae-soo looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "He told me something else, when he gave me the envelopes." She waited. He said, "Whoever comes, whatever they know, whatever happened between us, tell them this." He paused. "Tell them the debt is real, and it belongs to her." Chapter 12. She was back in the building by 7 the next morning. Seoryeon was not in the lobby. That was the first change Zariah noted, not with relief, but with the specific alertness of someone who had learned that the absence of an expected thing was often more informative than its presence. She had expected a second lobby conversation, a more direct one, a conversation that did not have the polished hospitality of the first. Instead, nothing. The security desk, the usual guard, her credentials checked in the usual way, the elevator, the penthouse floor, Mrs. O briefly at the end of the hall, who looked at her and nodded and looked away. Normal, which meant Seoryeon was doing something that required her not to be here. She went to the room. Taejin was awake, always awake, and when she came through the door, his eyes moved to her immediately. She had learned, across these weeks, to read the register of his attention the way you learn to read any language you are immersed in long enough. There were different kinds of his watchfulness, the watchfulness of assessment, the watchfulness of patience, the watchfulness of something that was processing, that was inside something, that had not finished arriving at wherever it was going. Today, it was the last kind. He already knew something had happened. She pulled the chair close, sat down, said nothing for a moment. Then, "I met him." 2 blinks. "He's well. He was worried about you." Something moved through his face that was not quite able to become an expression, but that she read anyway. "He had the envelopes." A pause. Then, very deliberately, with the weight of someone placing something they had been holding onto a surface, 2 blinks. "Well," she said, "you wrote the letter 11 months ago." He held her gaze. "Before I came here," she said. "Before the building, before the agency, before any of it." She waited. "How did you know someone would come?" He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man ordering something complex into the sequence that language required. Then he spoke. It was better today than yesterday. Still rough, still raw around the edges, still the voice of something that had been rebuilt from damage rather than preserved from it. But cleaner, more control. The words arrived in the room as words rather than as the material of words. He said, "I have known about you." She waited. "For 4 years, he said. The pauses between words were long, but the words were there. "Someone I trusted. Told me." A pause. "That her daughter was looking." She absorbed this. "You knew I was looking for you." He said yes, with his voice, not just his eyes. "And you didn't stop me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "No." She looked at him. "Why not?" The answer took a long time to arrive. She did not rush it. Outside the glass, Seoul was doing its morning. The river light, the traffic on the bridges, the accumulated ordinary momentum of a city that had no awareness of what was happening in this room. "Because," he said, slowly, carefully, like a man walking across ice who knows his weight is significant. "What I did." A pause. "To her." A pause. "Required. Someone to come." She sat with that. "You left a path," she said. He did not answer immediately. Then, "I tried." She thought about the envelopes, the financial records printed rather than digitized. The letter written 11 months ago and placed with the one person in his life who lived outside the structure. She thought about the specific configuration of those choices, not the choices of a man covering tracks, but the choices of a man leaving something findable for someone with the right reason to look. She said, "The letter tells me everything that happened in Los Angeles." 2 blinks. "I need you to be willing to say it. Not write it. Not blink it. Say it." He was quiet. "There are people outside this building who can receive this," she said. "Journalists, legal contacts, people my mother trusted who are still working." A pause. "But they need a voice. Documented, witnessed, recorded. They need to hear you say what the letter says." He was looking at her with the full attention that had not diminished once across all these weeks. If anything, it had intensified, the attention of a man who understood that the thing he had been moving toward, slowly, through weeks of stillness and recovery, and the particular education of lying in a bed while a woman spoke honestly at him, was now here, was now present, was asking something of him. He said, "I will say it." She looked at him. "All of it?" she said. He said, "All of it." She nodded once. Then she said the thing that had been sitting in her chest since the night before in Tae-soo's office, since she had read the letter and understood the full scope of what was in it. "The letter talks about who authorized the decision in Los Angeles," she said. He said yes. "And it talks about what my mother had found before they moved on her." He said yes. "She was close," Zariah said. It was not a question. She had almost enough. He was quiet. Then, "She had it," he said. "All of it." The room held that for a moment. "What happened to it?" Zariah said. "The documentation she had." His left hand moved. She gave him the notebook. He wrote for 3 minutes. She watched the letters form, steadier now, more confident, the handwriting of a man whose body was remembering itself. When he stopped, she read it, looked up. "It still exists," she said. He said yes. "Where?" she said. He wrote one more thing, an address. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. And for the first time in the entire architecture of these weeks, in all the mornings and the bowls of porridge and the one-sided conversations and the notebooks and the blinks and the slowly returning voice, she felt the ground beneath all of it shift from effort into something else, something that felt, carefully, like the beginning of the end. But Zariah Cole had lived long enough inside complicated things to know that the beginning of an end was also where the most dangerous moments lived. Because this was also the moment when Seoul, wherever she was this morning, doing whatever it was that her absence was covering, would have known that time was closing. And people with everything to lose were never more dangerous than when they understood that clearly. She put the notebook in her pocket. She said, "Tonight." He said, "Tonight." She found out her mother had the full documentation, and it still exists. What do you think happens when Seoul figures out they know where it is? Tell us below. Mrs. O knocked on the door of the room at 9:31 that morning. Zariah answered it. Mrs. O said, in the careful way of someone delivering a message they have been given word for word, "Ms. Han would like to see you at 2 o'clock, in the main office. She said, please don't be late." She said it pleasantly. She left promptly. Zariah closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment and looked at the room. The machines, the light, the man in the bed whose eyes had not moved from her since she turned back around. She said, "She wants to meet at 2. He said nothing. She's going to offer me something," Zariah said. "Or she's going to threaten me something. Either way, she's going to try to make me choose before tonight." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not going to choose before tonight." She pushed off the door and went back to the chair, picked up the bowl, continued feeding him. And in the main office, 2 floors below, Seoryeon sat at the desk that had belonged to someone else and looked at a document that had been placed in front of her 12 minutes ago by the man with no saved name, a document that contained a Mapo-gu address, a business name, and a photograph of Kwon Taejin's garage taken from the street at approximately 8:45 the previous evening. And in the lower right corner of the photograph, barely visible, the edge of a jacket. A gray domestic staff jacket. Walking out. Chapter 13. The office smelled of black tea and absolutely nothing else. Zariah sat down across from Seoryeon at 2 o'clock exactly and put nothing on the desk between them because she had nothing to put there. Her jacket, her notebook, her phone, all in her locker on the staff floor. She had emptied her pockets before coming down. Not because she was asked to, because she had decided that the cleanest position was the most visible one, and the most visible position left nothing for Seoryeon to find. Seoryeon looked at her across the desk with an expression that was genuinely pleasant and completely controlled. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," Zariah said. A pause. The kind of pause that was not awkward because both people in it were too skilled to let pauses become awkward. "I'll be direct," Seoryeon said. Zariah waited. "You went to Mapo-gu last night," Seoryeon said. Not accusatory, factual, the tone of someone reading a report rather than making an accusation. "To a business associated with Mr. Kwon's family." Zariah said nothing. "I understand the impulse," Seoryeon said. "You've become attached to his situation. That's a human response. It doesn't reflect badly on you." She reached beside her and placed a single envelope on the desk. "What I want you to understand," she said, "is that Mr. Kwon's condition is being managed within a legal and medical framework that was established at the direction of his own estate planning. His brother has been notified, formally, through the appropriate channels, of his incapacitation and its terms. There is nothing being concealed here that is not being concealed with full legal protection." She slid the envelope forward. "This represents 6 months of your current salary," she said. "In acknowledgement of the extraordinary care you've provided and as a formal close to your placement here, the agency has been notified that the position is being restructured." She looked at Zariah directly. "I'm asking you to take it," she said, "and to close this chapter, for your own sake." Zariah looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Seoryeon. She thought about her mother. Not the photograph, not the file, not the documents, the actual woman. The voice on the phone that became less frequent and then stopped. The specific quality of loss that arrived not all at once, but in slow, daily increments. The way the morning coffee at the kitchen table became a habit she observed rather than shared. The way the sound of the keyboard after midnight became a sound she missed before she had finished missing the person attached to it. She thought about Taejin saying, "I will say it." All of it. She thought about the address he had written in the notebook and what was at that address and what it would mean if Seoryeon reached it first. She said, "I appreciate what you're offering." Seoryeon waited. "But I can't accept it," Zariah said. The room was very quiet. Seoryeon's expression did not change. That was the thing about her. She had built such an effective neutral register that departure from it was almost impossible to detect. Almost. Zariah saw it anyway, the fractional reorganization behind the eyes. The half-second of recalibration. "I'd encourage you to think carefully," Seoryeon said. "I have," Zariah said. "This building has resources," Seoryeon said. "Legal resources. I want to be honest with you about that. If there are questions about what authorization you had to visit a family member of a patient in your care, questions about the scope of your agency contract, about your visa documentation, those questions can be raised." She said it without heat. That was the more effective version of a threat, delivered in the temperature of a reasonable concern. "I understand," Zariah said. "Then you understand I'm giving you an option," Seoryeon said. "A good one." "You are," Zariah agreed. And I'm choosing not to take it. She stood. Seoryeon looked up at her. Something moved through the room that had no name but that both women felt and neither acknowledged. I have a question, Zariah said, before I go. Seoryeon waited. You knew what was in those envelopes, Zariah said. You know what he prepared. Otherwise you wouldn't be here offering me money instead of just removing me. Seoryeon said nothing. You're not afraid of him dying, Zariah said. You're afraid of him talking. She let that sit in the room for one breath. That tells me something, she said. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard the complete and total silence of a woman who had just been read correctly and was deciding what to do about it. She walked out. Her heart was doing something that she did not let reach her face or her stride or the specific pace of her footsteps in the hallway. She walked the length of the corridor and pressed the elevator button and stood with her hands at her sides while the elevator came. Inside it, going up, she let herself be what she actually was for approximately 7 seconds. Scared. Not of Seoryeon specifically, of the gap between where she was and where she needed to get to by tonight. Of the distance between the address in the notebook and whatever Seoryeon was doing right now with the phone that was certainly already in her hand. Of the possibility that 12 years and everything she had built toward this moment would close before it could open. 7 seconds. Then the elevator reached the penthouse floor and the doors opened and she walked out and down the hallway and through the door of the room, and Taejin's eyes found her the moment she crossed the threshold. She said, she made her offer. 2 blinks. I said no. He looked at her. She's moving tonight, Zariah said. Whatever she was going to do about the address, she's going to move before we do, which means we can't wait until tonight. She was already pulling out her phone. Tae-soo answered on the first ring. She said, can you move right now, yes or no? He said yes. She said, the address your brother gave me. Whatever is there, I need you to go right now. Not tonight, now. And I need you to bring it to someone I'm going to call in the next 10 minutes. She gave him the contact. Her mother's colleague. The journalist in Seoul she had been building toward for the last 3 months. The one who had been waiting at a specific email address for something she had promised was coming. She ended the call, looked at Taejin. Your brother is moving, she said. He said, good. She sat down. She was still scared. That had not changed. But fear and movement were not contradictions. You could be afraid and still put one foot in front of the other. Her mother had taught her that, not in words, but in the simple, observable fact of what she had done with her life. She picked up the bowl. She fed him. They sat in the room together while Tae-soo drove across Seoul, and Seoryeon made phone calls 2 floors below, and the city outside the glass moved through its enormous, ordinary afternoon completely unaware. She chose 12 years of truth over 6 months of money. What would you have chosen? And what do you think Seoryeon does next? Every comment matters. We read them all. Tae-soo arrived at the address at 3:14 in the afternoon. It was a storage facility in Yeongdongpo, climate-controlled, private, the kind of place designed to hold things without asking questions about what they were or why. The unit number was one Zariah had read from the notebook and relayed to him over the phone. He stood in front of the unit door for a moment before he opened it. Inside was a single waterproof case, black, the kind used for documents and drives meant to outlast the situations that made them necessary. Inside the case, 3 hard drives, a sealed folder of printed documents, and a handwritten note with 2 lines. The first line read, for Zariah. The second line read, she was right about everything. He photographed everything in place before he touched anything, front and back, every document, every drive label. And at 3:31 p.m., the photographs began arriving in the inbox of a journalist named Park Soo-yeon, who had been waiting, in a small office in Mapogu, for something she had been told was coming, who looked at the first photograph, then the second, then closed her office door and began making calls. Chapter 14. Seoryeon found out about the storage unit at 4:07 in the afternoon. She found out from the man with no saved name who had been at the facility's entrance at 3:09, 5 minutes before Tae-soo arrived, and who had discovered the unit was not accessible to him because it was registered under a name he had not anticipated. Not Taejin's name, not Tae-soo's. A third name, a lawyer in Busan, whose involvement Seoryeon had not known existed and whose registration of the unit had occurred 14 months ago, 3 months before the gathering. Ma Taejin had been planning for a version of this for over a year. She sat with that for 90 seconds. Let the information settle into its proper position. Let the shape of it become clear. Then she moved. She was good at moving. She had always been good at it. The specific quality of decisive motion that most people who performed decisiveness did not actually possess. The decision and the action in the same motion. No gap between them. She called the building's legal contact. She called the financial manager. She called the man with no name and gave him 3 new instructions in sequence, each one dependent on the outcome of the previous. And then she did something that none of her calls had covered. She went upstairs. The door of the room at the end of the hall opened at 4:22, and she came through it with the same quality of motion she brought to every room she entered, purposeful, contained, reading the space in the first 2 seconds. She saw Zariah. She saw Taejin. She saw the chair close to the bed, the empty bowl set aside, the quality of the air in the room that communicated something ongoing and deliberate. She closed the door behind her. Zariah stood from the chair. They looked at each other across the room. "Sit down, Ms. Cole," Seoryeon said. "I'm okay standing," Zariah said. A beat. Seoryeon turned her attention to Taejin. Something passed across her face in that moment. Something Zariah had not seen there before. Not guilt, not regret. And not the softness of any prior connection between 2 people who had spent 2 years in each other's company. Something narrower than all of that. The expression of a person looking at something that has not resolved the way it was supposed to and recalculating in real time. She said to Taejin, "Whatever you've put in motion, stop it." He looked at her. "I can still contain this," she said. "If it stops now, if the material doesn't go further than it's already gone. There are outcomes here that protect everyone, including you." He looked at her steadily. She said, "Your empire is gone. You know that. I know that. What isn't gone is the part of this that could still destroy the people below you, the people who followed your instructions for 15 years without the protection your position gave you. They don't have that protection anymore. If this goes public, fully public, they go with it." She was good. Zariah watched her and acknowledged it privately. The argument was real. The leverage was real. The specific shape of it, turning his history of protecting his people into the mechanism by which he might be convinced to protect the person who had betrayed him, was exactly what a person who had studied Taejin for 2 years would reach for. Taejin looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice was rough and it carried, and it was unmistakably completely his. He said, "You studied me for 2 years." She said nothing. He said, "You understood what mattered to me." Still nothing. He said, "Then you know that I already decided, before she came." A pause. "Before any of this." He looked at her with the specific clarity of a man who has put something down and has no intention of picking it back up. "What I built should not have been built. What I protected was the wrong thing to protect." Seoryeon looked at him. He said, "I'm not stopping it." The room was very quiet. Zariah watched Seoryeon absorb this, the specific discipline of someone absorbing something they have not planned for, incorporating it into a new calculation without letting the seams of the transition show. She turned back to Zariah. She said, "Then I'm going to make you an offer, a real one, not 6 months of salary." Zariah waited. "The documentation in that storage unit includes things about your mother," Seoryeon said. "You know that. What you don't know is that not all of it is what you think it is." She paused. "Some of it is documentation of what she was investigating, and some of it is documentation of who else was involved. People who are still alive, still active, still in positions where they can affect what happens to information that comes for them." She let that land. If this goes wide without preparation, Seorian said, those people will move, and they will move on everyone connected to it. That includes you. That includes his brother. That includes anyone your journalist contact calls in the next hour. She looked at both of them. What I'm offering, she said, is to tell you who they are, before the story goes out. Give you the full picture, not just what's in that case, but what's above it, what it connects to. A pause. Because the case alone takes down what I built here. What's above it takes down something much larger. Zariah looked at her. Why would you do that? She said. Seorian said, because I would rather be the person who handed over the larger thing than the person who spent the next decade in a legal structure that I do not control. She said it plainly, without performance. The first moment in the conversation, perhaps the first moment Zariah had seen at all, where the architecture of the woman dropped down to something underneath it, something that was just a person calculating survival. Zariah looked at Taejin. He looked back at her. She said to Seorian, you have until 6 o'clock, 2 hours. If what you give us is verifiable and expands what we already have, we hold the story for 48 hours. Enough time to build the broader context. She paused. If what you give us is incomplete or misdirection, she said, the story goes at 6 regardless, and we include documentation of this conversation. Seorian looked at her. She said, how are you documenting this conversation? Zariah said, the same way I documented everything in this room. And she looked, very briefly, at the camera in the upper corner. The one that Seorian's own security team managed. The one Zariah had understood 3 days ago was recording everything to a server she did not control, and had started using that fact rather than working around it. Seorian looked at the camera. Something in her face shifted, and then she did something neither of them expected. She sat down, in the chair that Zariah had moved close to the bed weeks ago and never moved back. She sat down, and she started to talk. She sat down and started talking. What do you think she knew that was bigger than all of this? We want your theories in the comments. What was above Taejin that this whole time was watching from higher ground? She talked for 1 hour and 43 minutes. Zariah did not interrupt. Taejin did not interrupt. The machines breathed. The city outside the glass moved through its evening, and the camera in the upper corner recorded every word to a server that Seorian controlled. And also, because Zariah had spent 3 days finding out where the secondary backup went, to a server she did not. At 5:58, Zariah sent a single message to Park Soo-yeon's encrypted line. 2 words, hold 48. At 5:59, Seorian stood, straightened her jacket, and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle and did not turn around. She said, I am not a good person. Nobody in the room disagreed. She opened the door and walked out. And in the bed, in the room that had once smelled of neglect and had slowly, across weeks, come to smell of barley tea and morning light and the particular human warmth of a person who chose to stay when leaving was easier, Kwon Taejin looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at Zariah, and he said clearly, without a pause, what happens now? She said, now we finish it. Chapter 15. 48 hours moved the way important time moves. Faster on the surface, impossibly dense underneath. Park Soo-yeon worked without sleeping. Zariah knew this because she was working the same way. In shifts between the room and Tae-soo's garage and the small apartment in Mapogu that had become, in the last 2 days, something close to a situation room. Documents spread across the floor, hard drives connected to a laptop, photographs of pages, voice memos of details too complex to write quickly enough. The journalist was thorough in the way that good ones always were, not just in what she included but in what she questioned. Every document verified through a second source before it was accepted. Every transaction traced to a primary record. Every name cross-referenced through public records and private databases she had spent a career building access to. She called Zariah on the morning of the second day. I need him to record something, she said. On the phone with witnesses, his voice, his name, the key facts. I can work with the documentary evidence alone, but if he can speak, if the voice exists as part of the record, what we publish cannot be minimized. Zariah said, "He can." She brought the phone upstairs. Taejin held it, left hand, which had developed enough steady function to grip without tremor. And Park Soo-yeon asked him questions in Korean that Zariah did not need to translate because she had learned, across these weeks, enough to follow the shape of what was said. He answered. Every question. His voice was not what it had been. It was still rough, still carrying the damage of 2 months of disuse, still not the voice of the man who had moved through rooms and ended careers with 11 minutes of silence and a manila folder. But it was his. And in it, across 45 minutes of recorded conversation, he said the things that the letter had contained. What his operation had done in Los Angeles 14 years ago, what her mother had found, what decision had been made and by whom, and through what chain of instruction it had traveled before it reached the hands that acted on it. He said it all. He did not soften it. He did not contextualize it in ways designed to diminish his role. He said it the way a man says something he has needed to say for a long time and has finally found the moment and the person to say it to, with the specific plainness of a statement that has been carried silently through enough years that all the protective language that once surrounded it has finally worn away. Zariah sat in the chair beside the bed and listened. She had known, intellectually, the outline of what he was saying. The letter, the documents, the 12 years of building toward the shape of this information. She had understood it as fact for days now. Hearing it said aloud was different. It was the difference between knowing a weight existed and feeling it in your hands. She sat and she listened, and she let herself feel what it actually was. Not the version of it she had needed to keep contained in order to function. Not the managed, operational relationship to the information that had gotten her through the planning and the agency call and the weeks in this room. The actual weight of it. Her mother had been 38 years old. She had been 11 floors underground in a story that was more important than the people who needed it buried could afford to let it become public. She had been right, and that rightness had cost everything. Zariah sat in the chair and listened to the man who knew that cost better than anyone else still living, speak it plainly into a phone, and she did not look away from his face, and he did not look away from hers. When it was over, Park Soo-yeon said she had what she needed. Zariah ended the call. The room was quiet. She said, "How do you feel?" He thought about it. Then he said, "Empty." A pause. But clean. She understood that. The story published at 7 in the evening on the 48th hour. Not in a single outlet. Soo-yeon had spent the 48 hours building a simultaneous release across 4 publications. 2 Korean, 1 British, 1 American, in a coordination that meant no single legal action could suppress it before it had reached enough readers to become irreversible. The financial documentation went first. The transaction logs, the routing histories, the annotated records in Taejin's handwriting, the paper trail of an empire that had operated in the space between legitimate business and the things that legitimate business was used to conceal. The second layer was Seorian, her acquisition of accounts, her rerouting of assets, the specific dates and amounts and decisions that mapped the 47 days during which a paralyzed man had been managed into silence while his own resources were moved around him. The third layer was what she had given them in that room. The larger structure above Taejin's, the names that connected his operation to things older and larger and more deeply embedded than anything he had built. The names that had existed above him the way weather exists above the structures it acts on. That layer was the one that moved the phones. By midnight, there were 3 calls from legal representatives seeking injunctions that were already 14 hours too late. By 2 in the morning, one of the names in the third layer had issued a public statement through a law firm that accidentally confirmed, by its specificity, exactly which of the published claims it was most concerned about. By dawn, the first regulatory body had opened an inquiry. Zariah sat in the apartment in Mapagu and watched it move the way she had watched storms move from the window of the Peckham flat as a child, the specific, unstoppable momentum of something that had gathered and was now releasing all at once. She thought about her mother. She thought, "You were right about everything." And then she thought, the thing she had not let herself think. And across all of these weeks, because the thinking of it required a completeness she had not been ready to afford until now. I found it. She put her phone face down on the floor beside her. She sat in the quiet apartment in the gray pre-dawn of a Seoul morning, and she let the 12 years settle. Not resolve, not disappear, not become something simple that a feeling could fully address. Just settle into the specific shape of something that had found its resting place, that had been carried to where it belonged and set down, finally, with both hands. She sat there for a long time. Then she got up, put her jacket on, walked out. She was going back to the building, not because the work required it, not because the coverage or the documents or the recordings needed her, because there was a man in a room at the end of a hallway who had said her name first when his voice came back, who had written a letter 11 months before she arrived and left it where she could find it, who had looked at her from behind eyes that nobody else in that building had bothered to look into and had chosen, slowly, incompletely, at enormous cost, to become something other than what he had been. She was going back because that deserved to be witnessed. She went back. Not for the story, for something that doesn't have a clean name. What do you call what happened between them? Tell us in the comments, because we've been thinking about it since we started writing this. The morning light came through the floor-to-ceiling glass in long, flat sheets across the white floor, the way it always did. The machines breathed. The chair was still close to the bed. She sat down. He looked at her. She said, "It's done." He said, "Yes." She said, "Your brother is coming today. He knows where you are now." His expression did something she had seen it do only a few times across these weeks, something that cracked the composure not through grief, but through a specific, unexpected relief. The relief of a person who has been alone for longer than they knew until the moment they stopped being alone. She sat with him while the morning came in and the city woke up below them, and the phones on 2 floors of this building were ringing with calls that were no longer going to be Seoryeon's calls to manage. She sat with him the way she had sat with him every morning for weeks. Not the same as those mornings, but continuous with them. The same chair, the same window, the same light. And outside, on the hard drives and the printed pages and the 4 publication websites and the regulatory inquiry and the recorded voice of a man who had chosen, finally, to be accountable. Zariah Cole's last story was finishing the journey she had started for it 14 years ago. On time. Exactly where it was meant to go. Chapter 16. 3 weeks after the story published, Taejin walked. Not far, not confidently, not without the physical therapist on his left side and Tae-soo on his right, both of them calibrated to the pace of a man whose legs were relearning a negotiation with gravity. From the bed to the window, 11 steps, and then he stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass and looked at Seoul below him. He stood there for 4 minutes. Nobody spoke. Then he said, "It looks the same." Tae-soo said, "It always does." He turned around, slowly, let both of them help him back to the bed, sat on the edge of it rather than lying down, which was new. The physical therapist had been working toward this for a week, and he had not told anyone when it was going to happen. And now it had. Zariah was standing near the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, 11 steps. She said, "It was 12. He said quietly, "I know." He was counting everything now, the way people count when they have had counting taken from them, with the full attention of someone who has learned that ordinary things are not ordinary. The legal structure around him was complicated in the way that legal structures around people like Taejin were always going to be complicated. Many layers, moving parts, an inquiry that was expanding rather than contracting, lawyers whose billable hours were climbing toward figures that would have been unremarkable to him 18 months ago, and that now existed in the accounting of a man who was dismantling the means by which such figures had once been unremarkable. He had been clear, from the first conversation with his attorney after his voice came back, about what he intended. Not to fight the exposure, not to minimize, to cooperate with the full scope of what had been published and what was still being investigated in exchange for the legal architecture that made cooperation sustainable, testimony protected, health conditions documented, the gradual nature of his recovery acknowledged in the timeline of any formal proceedings. His attorney had said it was either the most strategically sound position he had ever seen a client take, or the act of a man who had decided that strategy was no longer the point. He had said, both. Seoul's situation was moving through its own structure. She had turned over the names in that room with the evident calculation of a person managing their own exposure, and the information she provided had proven verifiable and substantial, which complicated the legal picture in the specific way that cooperation always complicates legal pictures, through a mix of protection and contingency that would take years to fully resolve. She was out of the building within 72 hours of the publication. Where she was now was a matter Zariah had chosen not to track, which was its own kind of decision. The building itself was in transition. Taejin's accounts, those that Seoul had not reached before the story broke, and those that the financial investigation was in the process of recovering, were being held in legal trust while the full scope of the inquiry developed. The penthouse was no longer a penthouse prison. It was just a place he was receiving medical care with a door that opened when he wanted it to open. Tae-soo came every day. He came at 11 in the morning, by subway and then on foot, the same way he had come every day for the last 2 weeks of the previous month, from the garage in Mapo-gu that still had 2 cars on the racks and the radio playing something low and staticky in the back. He sat with his brother with the natural ease of 2 people who had spent so many years in each other's company that the silence between them was comfortable in a way that most silences were not. On the second day he came, Taejin had said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." Tae-soo had said, "You always made things complicated." He had said, "I know." Tae-soo had said, "Eend, stop." He had. Zariah was making arrangements, not permanent ones. She had not made permanent arrangements in a long time. It was the condition of a life built around the logistics of getting somewhere specific, which did not leave much room for the consideration of what came after. But she was making the kind of arrangements that people make when the thing they were moving toward has been reached, and the forward motion needs a new direction. Her contact in London. But for her sister, whom she called for 2 hours on the night the story published and did not try to explain in any efficient way, just let the 2 hours be what they were, her sister's voice saying, "Oh, Zariah," in intervals while she talked. Her mother's editor, who had been retired for 6 years, and who, when she called, answered quickly and listened quietly, and at the end of it said only, "She would have loved this." She had held the phone for a long time after that call. She was sitting in the chair by the window on the afternoon of the 11th step, not the chair close to the bed, a different chair she had pulled to the window side while Taejin sat on the bed edge, when he said, "What are you going to do?" She looked at the river. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's a new feeling." He said, "Is it good?" She thought about it. "Or ask me again in a month," she said. He nodded. They sat in the room while the afternoon light moved across the floor in the way it always had. The same windows, the same river, the same city going about its enormous, indifferent business below. The machines were mostly quiet now. The chair he had lain in for 2 months had been repositioned. The granite table had a cup of warm barley tea on it, next to a glass of water, next to the notebook that was nearly full. She looked at him. He was looking at the river. She thought about her mother, and about what had been carried and put down, and about the specific, complicated, unresolved, honest thing that existed between her and this man. Not forgiveness as a completed act, but something moving in that direction, through the real territory of what it required. She thought, this is the beginning of a different kind of difficult. And she was not afraid of it. 11 steps to the window. 12, actually. She kept count when he wouldn't. What does that moment mean to you? Tell us in the comments. This story carried a lot. We're grateful you carried it with us. But before you go, there is one thing left. One thing Taejin has not said aloud to Zariah. Not in the room, not in the recordings, not in any of the documentation or the testimony or the 45 minutes on the phone with Park Soo-yeon. Something he wrote in the letter that she read in Tae-soo's office and has not yet asked him about directly. She has not asked because she has not been ready. And in the room, on the afternoon of the 11th step, and he looks away from the river and looks at her and says, "There is something I still owe you." She looks at him. She says, "I know." He says, "Are you ready to hear it?" She sits with that for a moment. Outside the glass, Seoul holds its shape. The river moves, and Zariah Cole, who has been ready for 12 years and is only now understanding what ready actually costs, looks at the man across from her and says, "Yes." Chapter 17. He told her on a Tuesday, no ceremony, no preparation that she could see. He had asked Tae-soo to step out. His brother had looked at both of them and nodded and gone to find coffee in the staff kitchen. The way Tae-soo handled most things he understood without being told, by making room. The physical therapist had left an hour before. It was just the two of them in the room with the afternoon light coming through the glass. He was sitting on the edge of the bed. She was in the chair near the window. The notebook was on the table between them, closed. He said, "Your mother came to me." She went very still. He said, "Not through channels, not through the network, directly to me. She found a number. I still don't know how, which tells you what kind of journalist she was, and you see, and she called. And I answered." Zariah said nothing. "She said she had documentation of the shipping route and the financial layering and she was going to publish it," he said. "She said she was giving me the opportunity to speak first. On the record, before the story ran." He paused. "She was giving me a chance," he said, "to tell the truth. To be the person who said it rather than the person it was said about." The room was very quiet. "I didn't take it," he said. She looked at him. "I referred the call to the man below me who handled those situations," he said. "I told him it was a problem that needed to be managed. I did not ask how. I did not specify. I just moved it away from myself and let the machinery do what the machinery did." He said it plainly. "That is the truth," he said. "Not that I ordered it, that I didn't stop it, that I moved it to a place where I wouldn't have to know how it was resolved and then I didn't ask." He looked at her. "Your mother called me," he said. "Well, and I let someone else decide what that meant." Zariah sat in the chair and looked at him and absorbed the specific shape of this, which was not what she had spent 12 years believing and also was not better than what she had spent 12 years believing. It was adjacent to it. The same damage arrived at through a different path. A man who had not said the word but had spoken the silence that the word required. She had thought, across all these weeks, about what she would feel in this moment. She had thought she would feel rage, the old, specific rage that had lived under her sternum since she was 14 and had been the engine of everything she had built toward this. She had thought she would feel something close and sharp and finally directed at the correct target. What she felt was grief. Not new grief, old grief. I finally arrived at its correct address. The grief of a girl in a flat in Peckham waiting for a phone call, and a teenager at a kitchen table being handed a folder, and a woman in a Budapest cafe hearing the name spoken for the first time out loud. The grief of a person who had been right, and the strange, exhausting human relief that came with that. She sat with it. He did not move. He did not fill the silence with justification or additional context or the things people reach for when they have said something that cannot be unsaid and the person across from them has not yet responded. He sat with her in the silence. Finally, she said, She called you and gave you the chance to tell the truth. He said, yes. She said, and you sent it away. He said, yes. She said, and you spent the next 14 years knowing that. He looked at her. He said, yes. She sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, the same ceiling he had looked at for 2 months, and then looked back at him. She said, why did you write the letter? Before I came? Before any of this? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because she called me and gave me a chance, and I sent it away. And I decided eventually that if her daughter came, if someone came who had the same thing her mother had, the same particular kind of looking for the truth, I would not send it away a second time. He looked at her. I could not undo what I did, he said. I could only decide what to do with the next chance. She looked at him. The afternoon light moved across the floor between them. She thought about her mother picking up a phone and calling a number she had found through God knows what trail of careful journalism and waiting for the line to connect and getting through and choosing, with everything that she was, to give the person on the other end of that call the chance to be better than he had been. She thought about where that call had led. She thought about what her mother had believed, despite where that belief had taken her. She thought about herself, in this room, with a spoon and a cold bowl, and a man whose eyes tracked the ceiling, choosing to ask if anyone was home. Like mother. Like daughter. She said, she would have done the same thing you just did. He said, I know. She said, she would have given you the chance again. He said, I know. She said, I'm not her. He looked at her. But, she said, I understand why she did. She stood from the chair. She walked to the window and looked at the river for a moment. The Han River, moving through the city, indifferent and continuous. Then she turned back. She said, I'm not ready to call it forgiveness. He nodded. She said, but I'm not holding it closed either. He looked at her. She said, that's the most honest thing I have. He said, it's enough. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She said, Tae-soo is probably still in the staff kitchen. He said, he makes bad coffee. She said, he does. She walked to the door. Stopped with her hand on the frame. She did not turn around. She said, same time tomorrow? He said, same time tomorrow. She walked out. She said, I'm not holding it closed, not forgiveness, something more honest. What would you call it? We want your words for it in the comments, because some things don't have names yet, and that's exactly why we tell these stories. 3 days later, Zariah booked a flight, not away permanently, away temporarily, to London for 2 weeks, to sit in the Brixton kitchen with her aunt and go through the folder one more time, now that the folder had a completed chapter attached to it. To stand in the Peckham Street and look up at the 3rd-floor window that faced the wrong direction and had second-hand light and had been where she started listening. To do whatever the next thing was that she needed to do in the place where all of this had begun. She told Taejin she was going. He said, I know. She said, you could not possibly know. He said, you've been looking at the river differently for a week. She looked at him. He looked back. She said, I'll be back in 2 weeks. He said, I'll be here. And what he meant, and what she understood he meant, was not just the geographic fact of still being in the building. What he meant was the thing that people mean when they have been through something together that they did not expect to be through together. The particular kind of present tense that means I have not finished. That means there is more. That means whatever this is, it is not over. It is just moving into its next shape. She walked out of the building into the Seoul afternoon, took the subway to Mapo-gu, sat on the floor of her apartment with her bag open and her phone in her hand, called her sister, and said, I'm coming home for a bit. Her sister said, about time. And Zariah Cole, who had not cried since the Budapest Cafe 18 months ago, cried. Chapter 18. The notebook ran out of pages on a Thursday. Taejin noticed it first. He was the one using it, the left hand moving steadily across the last page with the confidence that had returned to it across weeks of daily effort, and the pen reached the bottom margin of the last page and stopped. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the door. Zariah came in 30 seconds later with a new one. Same size, plain cover. He looked at the new notebook. He looked at her. He said, "You knew." She set it on the table beside him and sat down. She said, "You were on the last page yesterday." He said, "You count pages." She said, "I count everything. You taught me that." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face that she had come to recognize, the expression he wore when something landed that he had not prepared a response to. It happened more often now, which was one of the specific ways in which the man sitting on the edge of his own bed in the morning light was different from the man who had arrived at this room 2 months ago. He had not finished changing. She did not think he ever would, entirely. That was not how it worked. The things a person had done did not become undone because they began to understand them differently. They became integrated, carried differently. I've pressed up against the new material of who that person was choosing to be and held there in permanent tension. That tension was not a failure. It was the actual content of accountability, the real substance of it, which looked nothing like the clean resolution that language suggested when it used words like redemption and justice and peace. It looked like a man on the edge of a bed in the morning with a new notebook, and a voice that was still not all the way back, and a left hand that had relearned trust, and a brother who came at 11 every day, and a woman in the chair who counted his pages. It looked like that. Park Soo-yeon's story had been running for 5 weeks. The inquiry had expanded to include 3 additional figures from the layer above Taejin's. The names Seoryeon had given them in the room, all verified through the documentation in the storage unit and Taejin's own recorded testimony. 2 of those figures had retained legal teams in the first week. 1 had left the country, which was its own form of confirmation. Soo-yeon had called Zariah the previous afternoon. She said, "There's going to be a second story. What comes from the inquiry over the next 6 months? I want you involved." Zariah had said, "Send me what you need." She had not given a longer answer than that because she was still working out what the longer answer was, still sitting inside the question of what came next, which was the most unfamiliar question she had held in a long time. She was used to questions about what came before. What happened, how it happened, who made it happen, and through what mechanism and where the documentation lived. Lane the past tense questions, the investigative ones. What came next was a different discipline. Taejin had started telling her things she had not asked about. Not about Los Angeles, not about the network, not about the things in the storage unit. Other things. The things that arrived when a person has been in the same room with the same person for long enough that the transactional vocabulary runs out, and what remains is everything else. He told her about growing up with Tae-soo in a house where money was present but not warmth, and about the specific way that absence had shaped the thing he built in adulthood, not as an excuse, but as information, as the honest accounting of origins. She listened to those things the way she listened to everything he said, all the way through, without performing the listening, without giving him more or less than it warranted. She did not offer her own things in return. Not yet. He did not ask. That was, she thought, how it actually worked. Not a transaction of disclosures, not an exchange, just the gradual, uneven, sometimes asymmetrical process of 2 people learning what they owed each other and what they didn't, and what the difference between those 2 things actually felt like from the inside. This morning, Tae-soo arrived at 11 with a paper bag from the market 2 streets over from the garage. "Yams," he said, from the vendor who always argued about the price even though the price never changed. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without particular weight. But he looked at Zariah when he said it, and she understood that he had found out somehow, from her sister, possibly, in or from a comment she had made to him on one of the evenings she had stopped by the garage, that yams from a market vendor were a specific thing, that they carried a specific frequency. She looked at the bag. She said, "Thank you." He said, "I didn't do anything." She said, "I know." Taejin watched this exchange from the bed. He said nothing, but his left hand moved and picked up the new notebook, and he opened it to the first clean page and held it there, as though registering the fact of all the space. She looked at the open page. She thought about everything that had been written in the one before it. Everything recorded in the room, and in Tae-soo's garage, and in the storage unit in Yeongdongpo, and in Park Soo-yeon's inbox, and in the inquiry documents that were growing daily in a government building across the city. Always all the pages of it, all the long, accumulated weight of what had needed to be said. She thought about her mother calling a number she had found through patient, careful, brilliant journalism and waiting for the line to connect and beginning to speak. She thought about what it meant to begin a new page. Then she picked up the bowl of warm barley tea from the table and settled back in the chair and looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Han River caught the morning in long silver fragments, and the city went about its enormous, ordinary business, and the light came in at the same angle it always had, falling across the white floor, steady and without condition. She said, "What did you want to tell me yesterday that you didn't?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Tomorrow." She said, "Okay." She handed him the tea. He took it with his left hand, and the room was quiet and full and entirely itself, which was enough, which was the thing that ordinary mornings were when you had learned, through the specific education of having almost lost them entirely, that ordinary was not the absence of meaning. Ordinary was where meaning lived. This story is done, but the people it moved in you, those aren't going anywhere. If Zariah's choice to show up changed how you see your own moments of choosing humanity over hardness, drop a comment below and tell us what it meant to you. Your words inspire the next person who reads them. That's how this works. That's why we do this. If this story found you at the right time, share it. Someone in your circle needs it today. And if you want to be here when the next story begins, subscribe right now and turn your notifications on. Because this channel exists to tell the stories that ask something real of the people who hear them. The stories that stay with you. We will see you there. We only tell the stories they tried to bury.